The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, the Distributed Battery Webinar Part 2. My name is Cody. I'll be your moderator today. This webinar will last for 3 hours and 15 minutes, and we do have a few notes to cover before we begin. Please be sure to be logged on to the webinar through your own individual connections so that we can accurately prove attendance in the event that Half Moon or you are audited by any licensing board. Furthermore, we require individual connections so that you can access the quiz at the end of the webinar. The quiz will automatically appear on your screen after I end the webinar. If you are unable to successfully submit the quiz, you can access the quiz via the thank you or follow-up email that is sent about an hour after the webinar has ended. Certificates will be issued for today's webinar. If you did not successfully submit the quiz after attending the webinar, please be sure to complete the quiz through the thank you or follow-up email. The certificates will be sent via email in PDF form, and if you need your certificates sooner, please reply back to any emails you have received regarding these seminars or call into our office. We will be taking questions throughout today's webinar. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the questions area of the GoToWebinar panel. And lastly, materials for today's webinar were sent via email. If you did not receive materials, you may access them in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. John Ross Cromer. He is a master electrician with a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and he is a NAB CEP certified installer. Take it away.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're gonna dive right in. The battery industry is exponentially growing. It's a changing industry, and so I do have updates and revise the program content on a semi-regular basis. So one thing you can do to keep yourself kind of up to date is to join my Slack community. That's the easiest way to do community discussion, to ask questions, suggest course updates, and also receive course updates. So if you want the recording from yesterday or today, the best way to do it is to join that Slack invitation link. Or you can always just send me an email. Might as well go ahead and put in my email address now into the chat link so that you have it. And there we go. Okay, so today we're going to do a lot more modeling. Yesterday we kind of talked about some higher level design issues, and basically the conclusion was, if you are bemoaning the fact that rooftop batteryless solar has become more commoditized and requires less design expertise than it used to, batteries are really where this expertise is coming back in. Let's see, we got a couple of questions. Keith said, I didn't hear what you said about the quiz, Cody. He's answering that. The quiz is graded, but it's really there just to indicate completion. So don't stress out about the answers too much. All right, so in solar design, there is a lot of resources available. One website that we explore is the Desire database. And just as a refresher, let me go ahead and put in the Desire link into the chat box. But the Desire website is a resource for not just solar policy, but other kinds of energy policy, and namely renewable energy policy in your state. So if you want to know about interconnection standards, net metering, maybe 20% of the country has a sales tax exemption on these products, which is rather substantial when you think about it. This is where you can get policies related to renewables. One kind of downside of the Desire website is they have these handy filters where you can just go in and click on your state. Let's just go ahead and click on California, because they have some storage incentives available. So when you click on the state, it'll take you to your state and policy issues. And they have these filters set up so that you can filter, say, by technology. So we can go with, say renewable energy, solar technologies, and photovoltaics, and then apply our filters. And now we have, all of the solar specific policies that are relevant to California. Here's a incentive program, for example. Here's our net metering policy. The problem is the battery industry, I guess it's so new that they don't have filters specifically for storage at this time. And the reason why I mention this is that, whereas there's a lot of resources available for, other forms of renewables, it can be a little bit difficult to determine what the battery policy is in your state. Some states are beginning to, write into law the right of a consumer to store energy on their own property, which is, it's kind of weird. It's like, why would that be an issue? Well, for these demand charges that we were talking about yesterday, there was a common question of, well, why can't I just go and crank a generator and run the generator during the demand time and avoid the demand charges? Well, you might have some air quality issues that say, okay, you can do that out in the countryside with your agricultural operation, but maybe within the city limits, you're not allowed to do, on-site power generation through, say, diesel generators. And for that matter, we have to remember that even though you can't see electricity when it's operating correctly, things can go disastrously wrong. And so, the denser a battery is, the smaller the battery gets with the same amount of storage capacity, there's potential for, well, what if you have a lithium ion battery in your home or apartment building, and then the apartment building burns down? That battery can be a safety hazard. So you could see where regulations might make it so that you can't store batteries on site in a building out of safety reason. And how we get to the finish line there is a matter of local policy. And these policies are still not as accessible to researchers as, say, the solar industry, which has had, a decade of development on the market. For that matter, the energy storage incentives are often not part of their own program. Let's go back to the Desire website here and look into California's storage incentive. Just bear with me. There we go. And we'll go and do storage into the search filter. So here's sales and use tax for storage equipment. So even just putting in search, here we go. Maybe I'm being overly filtered. Okay, let me take my filters off. You have to be a little bit more of a researcher to find this stuff. Let's go back up to our search tool. What you might have better luck going and finding if you do have battery storage incentives is just doing a Google search. And then here we go. We're at the what they call the self-generation incentive program. So some states like I believe Maryland and New York and California have some battery storage incentives. The Maryland one is a rather small program. The New York and California programs are larger. In the New York program, it's simply that there's a budget cap on the amount of commercial solar incentive you can obtain, and you get additional budget if you incorporate batteries into the program. So it's like an additional $50,000 of budget at the commercial level, and that'll give you, $50,000 to spend on batteries. California, what they have is it's a commercial, industrial, and residential incentive. If you go into larger projects, the incentive is paid out over 5 years. If you go into smaller projects, the incentive is paid up front. And what we can see is while they define, say, wind as a dollar per watt incentive, solar in the past has been defined as a dollar per watt incentive. Then we say for storage, maybe we have to get down into the details. And here we have for emerging technologies, we have advanced energy storage being a $1.30 a watt incentive, which I believe comes out to be on typical market pricing around a 30% additional incentive. Of course, that you only get these kinds of incentives in states that have higher tax rates so that they have the money to give back. If you live in a state that doesn't, say, have a state income tax or a state sales tax, then you might not have these. You might already have these incentives. You just they don't need to create them for you. Let's get back into the program. So there's a handful of states that have some storage incentives on the books, and you can find that through the Desire website. Now, here's something interesting. Solar has a 30% tax credit, and that 30% tax credit is around for another year, and then it begins to step down. Now, the cost of this stuff does decline year by year, and so by 2021, you don't have the 30% tax credit anymore, but it's a 26% tax credit. In 2022, the tax credit's still around. And then it drops down to 10%, which is not just a solar incentive, but other energy projects get a 10% investment tax credit from time to time. I used to work in the oil industry, and I was working on a oil refinery expansion project along the Gulf Coast. It was a $2.4 billion project before the budget escalated, and that was qualified for this energy investment tax credit at the time. It's not just a solar incentive. The question becomes, well, with solar, all expended costs qualify for this tax credit. The labor, even your local sales tax qualifies for this 30% federal tax credit. Now, I don't know what the restructuring of our tax law has done for that. You're going to have to go to your CPA for that information. But the question is, do batteries qualify for the solar tax credit? And the answer is yes, but only the portion of the battery bank that is charged by the solar array qualifies for the solar tax credit. So you can't buy a battery and a solar array and just say, okay, it all qualifies. What you have to do in this circumstance, and this is more important for the larger commercial facilities, I'd say, but you have to track all of the energy coming out of the array and all of the energy that is outflowing onto the grid and all the energy that is being charged with the battery. Because if the solar is reducing your demand at peak times and your battery is running during peak times, the question is, well, do you have enough solar power to charge the battery back up so that if your battery's running in the morning, and do you have enough surplus in the middle of the day when you also need demand reduction and the solar array is taking over? Do you have excess in addition to that to charge the battery back up so that the battery can be used in the evening? Or is it more cost effective given your region In the winter time, if you're say in Seattle and you're just going to be overcast all throughout the month of December, is it cost effective to say, well, I'm only going to charge up my battery 10 months out of the year with solar, and 2 months out of the year I'm going to charge the battery during off-peak times? You actually have to go in and readjust your claim on the tax credit, and there's a minimum threshold as well. I think it's around 80%. So if your battery is being charged half with the grid and half with solar, it may not qualify for the tax credit. And then if you claim the full tax credit and then you go and count your kilowatt hours, and it turns out that, hey, in the month of December it was economic to charge the battery with the grid and not with your solar array, you may need to amend your tax return and give some of that money back. So, the short of it is, yes, batteries can qualify with the solar tax credit, but only if those batteries are charged with solar power. So, to that extent, that makes sense, and that also can impact your net metering laws too. We've seen New Jersey say, hey, look, if you add batteries to your solar array, you may run the risk of disqualifying yourself from net metering, because if we catch you charging your battery with the grid and then your solar array is in the middle of the day outflowing with net metered credits, that's not the intent of net metering. Net metering is to kind of be a stopgap measure to accommodate solar growth without batteries. Now when you have batteries, there's some potential for double dipping, or for you to be outflowing electricity that doesn't come from renewable sources. And net metering is very much a 100% renewable policy. But generally, this is good news. Is that, yes, batteries do qualify for the solar tax credit, and while perhaps unsubsidized economics are better received by the public than subsidized economics, and there's always an element of subsidy when we talk about the electric grid. Uh, so it's hard to overcome this debate. The You might find that even though the bulk majority of the cost savings are coming from the battery bank itself, just by adding a solar array onto the facility and charging that battery with solar, the value of the tax credit makes the project more profitable. And for that matter, we have to remember that your battery may not be utilized every single day of the year. Based on your electrical process, the battery might only run, 4 or 5 days per month. And so to qualify the battery for the tax credit, you don't have to necessarily do a solar array that covers the entire roof or offsets 100% of your electricity. All you really have to do is do a solar array that is just large enough to charge the battery. And generally, while there is some little bit of credit back, and I haven't specifically done enough modeling to find an instance where it's better to do a battery that's charged 90% with solar rather than 100% with solar. And I do think those possibilities exist. There's also an element of keep it simple, stupid, where, if it's a matter of doing a 10 kilowatt array that charges the battery 90%, or a 15 kilowatt array that charges the battery 100%, it might just be worthwhile to go for the whole 100%. For that matter, the battery inverters, we were talking about advanced algorithms that control how the battery inverter outputs onto the grid. There are not only options in modeling, but options within the battery inverters themselves to prioritize charging the battery with on-site renewables rather than selling that electricity back. And whether or not that's cost effective is not just dependent upon your demand charges, but also depending upon your raw energy kilowatt hour costs too. So design software. There's a lot of solar design software on the market. In the solar classes, we kind of look further into Aurora, Helioscope, and Solar Design Tool. And these are tools that are useful and oriented towards the batteryless market. You know, the 99% of rooftop solar today in the United States is batteryless. And so all of the existing companies that are out there writing solar design software, they really don't prioritize batteries or energy analysis. It's more about how much solar can fit on your rooftop, what's your price of electricity, and what are the economics of that. And even when, say, like Solar Design Tool, you may have the battery inverter in the database, how the battery inverter and the charge controller work together to generate a one-line diagram. You might find that what is a great piece of software for the batteryless market kind of falls apart when it comes time to model your batteries. There are advanced free softwares available for battery modeling. In the solar classes, we talk about how PV Watts is a very useful tool for doing an estimate of your solar production. We did that really quick example yesterday. PV Watts' big brother is called SAM, which is the System Advisor model, and you can also download it. It's put out by National Renewable Energy Labs, and it has a storage component that you can use to not just do solar, but also put in your building interval data and put in your battery bank size and do some kind of free energy modeling that way. Although I'd have to say the learning curve for SAM is a lot steeper than PV Watts, and the functionality of SAM is not necessarily something that is you'd want to model a commercial product off of. It's still a little raw, where you need to go and kind of manually input the discharge rates of your battery rather than analyzing the data for the optimal configuration. So what we're going to do today is we're going to use PV Watts to show you how far you can go into modeling your battery bank with PV Watts. And when I did my off-grid home design, I used PV Watts because the PV Watts is the raw data that actually goes to feed the energy reports in these other softwares. So the same weather stations that PV Watts gets its data from, the commercial design softwares utilize the same data. So it is possible to build some, say, off-grid modeling by taking your customer's electric bill, making some assumptions, and using the raw PV Watts data to build your own model. If you start doing a lot of modeling, or you want to model a commercial optimization, what we're going to learn is that you really have to do a bunch of different models and kind of guess and check yourself or experiment into the optimal configuration in terms of cost effectiveness. And so by the time you're crunching all the numbers over and over and over again, ponying up for the more expensive commercial design software is where you want to go. So we're going to show you PV Watts modeling, and then we're going to take that process and not necessarily show you how to do it in commercial design software, but utilize some commercial design software just to speed up the process for the purpose of class discussion today. Okay, so here is a building, and what we see in dark blue is the current load profile of the building. And so here's Friday, and we see this is just what a typical large facility would look like. That might be an office building or a skyscraper or something like that that's open during the week, but really not open on the weekends. And so we see, on Friday, this huge surge of energy, and then the weekend comes in, and we have relatively stable, this is what would be called base load power, whereas this would be called peak power. And so we see over the weekend, no one's using the facility and we're just operating at base load. And then Monday comes up and we see another, escalation in production. And we actually see, we see this little, let me clear this. We see this little shoulder peak right in the morning. And then we see this midday peak in the middle. Our overall trend is up. And then we see this afternoon shoulder peak, which is actually our maximum peak for that day. Moving on into, say, Tuesday or Wednesday, we see this similar instance where, maybe the overall trend is this kind of camel hump, but when you actually itemize it into these 15-minute interval windows, and each little point here represents a 15-minute interval reading, so it's not really a point, it's a 15-minute average at that peak. So we see another morning peak, another midday peak, another shoulder peak, and we see this overall trend is maybe on the hottest day of the month, we get to our maximum peak right in the middle of the day. But we also see the problem being illustrated with a solar array. If we go and add this solar production that's shown in green here, it's going to be reducing this midday peak, but that's not going to be, even though this is peak energy being, taken off of the grid, now we have our shoulder peak in the morning and in the afternoon kind of become where our bill comes from. And so if our solar array at our maximum peak time, the danger is you can say, okay, well, solar is going to take care of our peak demand, but as far as that peak demand charge goes, all it's going to do is push that what was the peak, it's going to push the demand charge just into the solar peak. And so if the solar array size is, say, let's define this space as being 200 kilowatts, the demand charge savings might actually only be 50 kilowatts. And then again, the danger is if a solar array comes right here and a cloud turns that solar array off, our peak could spike back up and we would have one 15-minute period where that one cloud in the sky turned the array off. So that's why historically we have not been able to model demand savings with solar, even though it is substantially reducing the building demand during the day, just not quite enough to overcome the limitation of that electric bill. If this commercial facility had access to real-time electricity pricing, then they would see those savings roll off their bill, because the real-time electricity pricing is updated every 15 minutes along with your building interval data. But just like a residential consumer has a simplified electric bill, they're not being billed for demand, they're just being billed for energy. A commercial facility has a simplified electric bill. They're not being billed for their real time of electricity usage. They're just being billed for their maximum demand and the amount of energy they use. And so we see here where, in this specific case of demand charges, solar is producing expensive premium electricity, but how the client is being billed for that electricity does not allow that value to come to market. And it used to be 10 years ago, you would have very intellectual debates on, well, what is the implication of that, where you have premium energy being compensated at avoided cost rates. Would that suggest that solar is profiting the utility, whereas the counter argument might be that the utility is losing profit? So where does that dividing line actually fall was a subject of debate. Well, now we can take this debate one step further and say, boom, let's add a battery here and start shaving off the shoulder peak in the morning, in the evening, and actually achieving our demand reduction. Now, what this also suggests is that there is an optimization point that says, well, we notice these shoulder peaks in the morning and the evening are now spiky. So what used to be a relatively flat curve is now spiky. And it could be that the most cost-effective solar array is one that just kind of goes and shaves off the very tip top of the peaks of your power curve. I like to say that this is mountaintop removal for your electric bill. And so we charge our battery in the valley, and then we use it to shave the peaks off of our load profile. Those are the most expensive hours of operation. And if we did that, we would see that if we're trying to just shave off the very tops of the peaks, there's going to be many days of the month where we're not using our battery at all. And then some of that, we're only going to be using a little bit of the battery on certain days, just as insurance that the building demand doesn't surge and we see those demand charges. And this is very interesting to me because what it suggests is that the economies of scale that you see in solar are not necessarily applicable to the battery industry, where you see the cost of residential solar costing twice as much as a larger commercial array. Well, what this suggests is that maybe a smaller, more expensive per unit battery bank only is a lot more effective at shaving these small spiky peaks. But the larger our battery gets, the longer our battery is going to have to operate. So if we try to do load leveling all the way down to this line, our battery is going to be running for 3 hours here and 3 hours there and 4 hours here and maybe additional 3 hours. So we have a 7-hour day, a 3-hour day, a 3-hour day, a 7-hour day, and now what we're doing is we're running our battery and we're having to size our battery for almost daily operation. Whereas if we only went for half the demand reduction, now our battery's running, let's just call it for 15 minutes. Here it's running for 15 minutes. Here, let's just call it an hour. And so, basically to achieve, half of our demand savings off of our bill, we might only need a battery that runs for, say, 10 hours a month. But to go the next step further and achieve twice as much demand savings, now our battery might need to be running for, 100 hours a month and be 100 times larger. So even if we get a 20% discount by doing 10 times as much battery bank, it's that smaller battery bank that is more cost effective. And what's interesting is we look at the production curves of batteries and we say, okay, well, when I got into solar in 2008, the price of a solar module itself was $3 a watt. And here 10 years later, it's more like 60 cents per watt. We've seen, an 85% come down in the cost of hard materials. Even if a similar economies of scale curve is applied to batteries, what that might say is, well, today, why don't you just start out with doing a small battery bank? Dip your toe in the water, and actually demonstrate to the client with a smaller system that the battery load leveling model works. And perhaps that means that today you don't need a battery that will last for 30 years or 15 years. Maybe you only need a battery that lasts for 5 years. And we'll see what lithium ion looks like 5 years from now, but we might use a less efficient system today. And some of the infrastructure you put in is going to be reused. The battery inverter, the charge controllers, the solar array will keep clicking along. There's this opportunity to do what's called a starter battery, which is to say, why don't you put in a battery with a short lifetime and run the heck out of it and see cost savings, and then also see what the battery looks like the battery market looks like 5 or 10 years from now, given that we're going into this exponential growth phase. On the other hand, there are legitimate job sites where you want to do the project now and you never want to touch that job site again for decades. Like let's say I want to do a weather monitoring station in the middle of Alaska. I might go for a battery that has a 30-year life instead of a 5-year life because I don't want to go back out there. If you're doing even if it's as simple as putting a battery on top of a radio tower, what's the cost of maintenance to climb up the tower and maintain the battery? There's other industry specific costs that might push you towards a higher end, higher cost, more expensive battery. But for many customers that are, just the building down the street on a high demand charge, using these premium batteries that more efficiently use their energy isn't necessarily the best or most cost effective choice. So what we see in today's market is that the lithium ion battery industry is winning the race in terms of the industry scaling up and manufacturing. We do see the lead acid industry responding in terms of growth, but all the major battery giga projects that are planned are in lithium ion. There's some other kinds of batteries that get us closer to 100% efficient, say, fuel cells called flow batteries, but they're still kind of in the research and development phase. And the only kind of shovel-ready flow battery company that I know of called RedFlow, based out in Australia, they recently announced that, or not, I guess a year ago or so now, they announced that they were leaving the residential market and just focusing on larger utility scale size batteries. And that might indicate that either what's specific about the way flow batteries are designed with large tanks of liquid only lends itself to utility scale, or it might just show that just like silicon is outcompeting thin film, and theoretically thin film should be the better technology. It's just the infrastructure and economies of scale of the cheaper, more traditional stuff is making that technology more cost effective. So looking at different kinds of storage, we have flywheels and capacitors and lead acid batteries and lithium ion batteries, and then we have higher end lithium ion batteries, and then maybe batteries that don't make their cathodes and anodes out of lithium at all, but they might use sulfur or other kinds of material. And then we also have mechanical storage. A lot of the larger utility scale kind of experimental storage projects to date have been like compressed air, taking a salt dome that has been kind of mined for its natural gas and now it's empty. Well, can we pump air down into that salt dome and then have the pressure extract the air on demand? Or take a dam, if you have a hydroelectric dam, well, let's say we run into this issue where, during the middle of the day, we have peak demand. And then at night, in the middle of the night, our demand goes back down. And now we have solar coming and creating what the, doomsday sayers say is this duck curve that's going to cause an energy crisis. Well, let's say we start getting so much solar power that the price of electricity in the middle of the day all of a sudden goes negative. Well, at that point, the efficiency of a system doesn't really matter. We have, in the middle of the day, unlimited, clean, and free electricity. So why don't we take what used to be a very inefficient process of pumping water uphill? Why don't we take that dip and use it to pump water uphill and take advantage of our already in place mechanical infrastructure. That's what pumped hydro would be. But as of 2017, there is now more storage, energy storage, and chemical storage rather than mechanical storage. So, until we get to an era where we have, not just solar power providing 100% of our electric needs, but we actually have a tremendous surplus of renewable energy. Let's say our potential for solar is producing 3 times as much power as what we're actually consuming. That Star Trek universe, 200 years from now, assuming other forms of energy haven't been developed by then, we might see mechanical storage come back into fashion. But right now, the emphasis is on chemical storage. Another aspect of storage is how quickly the battery can be charged and discharged. And again, I want you to think about that 15-minute interval data on how we're being billed for our electricity. There are, tremendous applications for storage that need something faster than a 15-minute window. What a very popular application is energy storage in elevators. So you think about an elevator is just a weight that goes up and down a 100-story tall building all the time. It would be nice if we could store when that potential energy is being released and the elevator is coming down the building. It'd be nice if we could store that and use it to spring the elevator back up to the top. And, the next time you get in an elevator and go up to the 100th floor, it doesn't take you 15 minutes. It takes you 1 minute. And so, lead acid, being able to completely discharge a lead acid battery, you need a process that takes minutes rather than seconds. And even with lithium ion, you might have a ability to do a 60-second discharge, but still with, say, an elevator, maybe 60 seconds is not quick enough. And so that's where capacitors and flywheels really shine, is in instances where you need that immediate dispatch and release of storage. Maybe a supercapacitor would be better for electric vehicle regenerative braking systems rather than lithium ion batteries even. So, maybe we'll see as supercapacitors come to market, they add additional miles per gallon to our existing gas vehicles, and we have capacitors in our cars instead of batteries. Lithium ion is really competitive to lead acid in terms of being able to be discharged and recharged efficiently in a matter of minutes. And so when we look at the performance differences between lithium ion and flooded lead acid, and we look at, say, demand management or load leveling, both technologies can be discharged over a 15-minute period and be reducing the demand on the building. It's just that you're going to have a lot more loss in the battery of a lead acid at that time. So you might have, if you're taking a lead acid battery that's rated for a 2-hour discharge cycle and you're trying to discharge it fully in a half an hour instead, you might lose half of the energy in that battery from just the heat that is being generated through the cables. Now, is that heat going to burn your building down? Well, that's why you have tremendously thick cables that are appropriately rated for the amperage that's coming out of that battery. So that's more of a function of National Electric Code sizing, where you can see how much amperage is coming out of the battery and you size your cables appropriate to that amperage. What you're really losing compared to lead acid versus lithium ion, and lithium ion will have that same problem when they're discharging. It's just it'll be to a more efficient extent. And so you look at the round trip efficiency of how much energy went into the battery and how much energy came out of the battery, and lithium ion is going to be the more efficient system, which is very interesting when you think about it, because say out in California, they're doing lithium ion all over the place. But out in California, you not only have high demand charges, you also have high energy charges. So you don't want to just be concerned about the kilowatt component of the bill. You also want to be concerned about the kilowatt hour component of the bill. But in the middle of the United States, you might have a bill like we'll look at in a little bit, where it's the kilowatt hour component is at avoided cost at 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and 90% of the bill is in the kilowatt charge. So the fact that we lose a lot of our energy by discharging a industrial flooded lead acid battery for demand management, that might mean that it's not economic in California where energy costs are high, but it might make more sense in Colorado where energy costs are low. Under each system, you might get the same demand savings. And then it becomes, well, which technology is more cost effective, flooded lead acid or lithium ion? That really depends on the cost of the energy itself. And so for that matter, if you are looking at, say, off-grid building design, and you say, okay, well, which should I use? Should I use a lead acid battery for going off-grid, or should I use what the industry is saying is a better battery? Should I do lithium ion for going off-grid? Well, it's kind of counterintuitive, but and if you're just generating your energy in the middle of the day and you're not generating any energy at night, you're going to have such a large solar array that you're going to be producing too much energy. In an off-grid system, you want to make sure that your batteries are topped off every single day. And so if I'm living off grid, I'm going to be oversizing my solar array regardless of what kind of battery technology I use. And so the efficiency of my system is not that important. Now, if I'm trying to do like a system on top of a parking lot light, and I only have a 50-watt solar panel instead of a 10 kilowatt array, because I'm limited with how much weight and surface area I can put at the top of the pole, then I have an instance where I only have a little bit of power. If I'm designing a satellite and I'm blasting it into outer space, and every pound of weight is costing me $10,000, so I'm limited by how much stuff I can actually blast into outer space, then I want to go for the lightest weight, most energy dense solution. But in an off-grid cabin, that might not be the same design scenario. So just blindly assuming that lithium ion is going to give you the best economics is discounting the fact that in your specific application, the efficiency of the system may not be as important as you think. If the bulk majority of your cost savings is coming from kilowatt demand reductions, remember, kilowatts are power. That's instantaneous. The kilowatt hour is energy. And so if most of your savings comes from kilowatts rather than kilowatt hours, the efficiency of the kilowatt hour component is not nearly as important as your capital expenditure to achieve those kilowatt savings. And for that matter, lithium ion costs so much more than flooded lead acid that the capacity becomes an issue. If I only have a 10 kilowatt hour lithium ion battery and my home goes overnight and I'm consuming more than 10 kilowatt hours, it doesn't matter if I've consumed that in the most efficient manner possible, I'm out of electricity. If I can buy a 50 kilowatt hour flooded lead acid battery bank, it may just be a matter of controlling my facility energy so that instead of having an air conditioner that clicks on and clicks off and clicks on and clicks off, I get a variable frequency air conditioner that costs more money up front, but it's able just to run at a constant power level throughout the entire day, and not click on and click off and click on and click off. And so that my amperage being drawn out of the storage medium comes more slowly, and at that point the economics of flooded lead acid makes a lot more sense. In fact, where I think that this is going to go is basically to say that flooded lead acid technology is really good for, running a building's base load, and then you might want to have a more expensive lithium ion technology take care of these peaks. And so that's when I started getting into off-grid design. I was kind of shocked to learn that, say, Schneider, which has an inverter that can take multiple AC inputs, what we were thinking with our off-grid home was, well, let's do lead acid now, and over time, as the lead acid starts to degrade, in 10 years, we'll go and add a lithium ion battery on top of that to manage the spikes. And so we can have the more cost-effective flooded lead acid taking care of our base, and the more responsive, efficient lithium ion taking care of the spikes. And those concepts are a little bit ahead of what the manufacturers are willing to support at this time. So a flow battery is basically a big tank of ions. It kind of looks like a fuel cell where I'd say they're more experimental, they're more efficient, but they don't have the responsiveness of a lithium ion battery. So flow batteries might be better for just doing overall load reduction on a utility grid, and not necessarily serve the variable power of a particular building quite so well. And they're still in the research and development phase. Figure 13 graph of battery megawatt commissioned on what date? So this chart ends at 2013. So I guess it's a little bit obsolete. We have another chart of batteries coming to market in a couple of slides. So when you're looking at kind of the shovel-ready batteries that are on the market, there's a few different categories. I was surprised to learn that the Tesla lithium-ion batteries are not top shelf. I think Tesla and I think top shelf, but Tesla and their kind of Chinese rival LG Chem, they're really aiming for not the most expensive, most efficient lithium-ion technology on the market that might last 30 years. They're really looking for kind of a middle-of-the-road lithium-ion battery that might only last 15 years. When you think about it, if I have a solar array and the salesman knocks on my door and says, I want to sell you this solar array, and it's going to reduce your effective cost of energy by half, and it lasts for 30 years. What he's basically asking me to do is pay 15 years of electric bills up front to reduce my electric bill by half over a 30-year time frame. The more efficient and the lower cost the battery gets per cycle, and over long term, absolutely there are advantages for going with a higher end, lower cost battery. But even if you're saving 50% over 30 years, just coming up with the capital for that purchase becomes a project disqualifier. So, when you see the high-end lithium iron phosphate batteries that cost $1,000 a kilowatt hour, those might not be the best for running a home off grid. If I'm Michael Dell and I want to put a battery in my home in Hawaii and never have to worry about maintenance, then yeah, there's a top shelf solution for that. If I don't need a large battery, if I'm doing a weather monitoring station in the middle of Nevada and I'm burying the battery underground to avoid heat, and I don't want to have to dig the battery back up every 5 years to replace it. I want to go for something that's really long lasting, and so there is a role for a very expensive lithium iron phosphate battery. Even on on a residential job site, let's say you look at your generator, a gas generator. If you don't have the little pull crank to auto start a gas generator, you have an electric start. And so the concern is, well, when I need that generator, is the battery actually going to start it or not? You might have the same thing in the solar industry where you have a battery on site and the battery's role is not to provide backup power during a grid failure. The battery's role might just be to start the solar array during a grid failure during the day. And so, while it may not be appealing to a customer to hear during a blackout, you're going to have power during the day and you're not going to have any power at night. At the same time, you look at, say, Hurricane Sandy victims, and they'll say, well, just give me the power during the day because I haven't had power for 2 weeks. And so having a incredibly expensive but also incredibly resilient battery that you don't have to worry about for 30 years, has a role in our electronic design. It's just you might not be trying to run your entire building off of that battery. It just might be there to start up a solar array or start up a generator and or power a remote, very small application. And then you get into kind of more mainstream lithium ion where they're not using the most expensive cathode or anode material. They're using a cathode or an anode that will degrade over time, even though they know that there's better materials out there, simply because they're making a sacrifice to say we also have to have this be something that people can afford. Now, I think that the real decision is, are you going to use a AGM or gel lead acid battery versus a mid-range lithium ion battery? Because the lithium ion batteries are about twice as expensive as the sealed AGM or gel batteries, and they have a lot more life and a lot lower levelized cost of storage. So that's where you start getting into, is it better to go for capacity or efficiency and longevity and lower total levelized cost? When you're and there's something that's very unique about these two categories, even though they use different materials, and it's still true of the high end, but this is so expensive, you're usually not deciding between lithium iron phosphate and lithium ion. Usually you're going with lithium iron phosphate if either you have the money for the most amount of bling, or the application is either so small that you don't want to have to worry about it for 30 years, or so remote that the cost of maintenance is prohibitively expensive. What's a little bit close together is just kind of your mainstream lithium ion and your maintenance free lead acid. because with a flooded lead acid battery, you have to maintain it. While the chemical reaction is occurring, it is evaporating water. And so you have to keep adding water, and on an industrial flooded lead acid battery that's being used routinely, you have to water it, almost every 2 weeks when you're using it on a daily cycle. And in addition to that, there's some conditioning modes that you put onto a flooded lead acid battery to better maintain the anode and prevent the plaque that builds up on the anode that ultimately results in it being less efficient and failing. Now, there's nothing magical about a sealed lead acid that says you don't have this plaque buildup. And so when you look at, say, like a sealed lead acid versus unsealed lead acid, you may not need to maintain the sealed lead acid, but it also doesn't have nearly the life of flooded lead acid, and that's because and also the performance of flooded lead acid, and that's because you get advantages within the lead acid sector if you can let that gas not be captured inside the battery, but to be released and vented to atmosphere. And you gain some longevity of that lead acid, which means you can cycle it more deeply if you're able to recharge the battery all the way up to the top and burst some of the plaque off of that anode to get dissolved into the electrolyte. And so when you look at, say, flooded lead acid compared to sealed lead acid, the sealed lead acid costs more and it doesn't last as long, and you generally will do it when the customer doesn't want to have to worry about maintenance. And so if you're doing an off-grid home where the customer is living in the home, it may not be a big deal for them to go and top off their battery with some water every 2 weeks. But if it's a vacation cabin out in the middle of the woods and the building's going to sit vacant for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, you might go with something that's lower maintenance, even though it costs more and won't last as long. And at that point, that's when you say, okay, well, if you have the budget for a no maintenance battery, if you want a battery that the client doesn't have to maintain, do you have the budget for something that over the long run is going to be more cost effective? If you have a client that does not want to maintain their batteries, then that's a good time to start considering lithium ion over lead acid. If you have a client who is more hands-on and you have a site where you can do a larger battery that emits gas, which can be vented to the outside, such as a house versus a condo, then just you want to consider flooded lead acid. Oh, we have a comment that LG Chem is Korean, not Chinese. So thanks, Daniel. So when we were doing this off-grid residential design, we were facing about $20,000 of interconnection costs from the utility. And the customer already knew they wanted to do solar. They were very hands-on and they were kind of doing a do-it-yourself. And this customer had actually intended a portion of this land to be a community solar project and had submitted an application for the utility community solar project and was willing to underwrite the project, even though the utility was only going to purchase the electricity for about half of retail value. So it seemed like a slam dunk. The utility, the co-op, was going to get distributed energy at half a retail value. It was the utility's own program. It wasn't going to increase anyone's electricity costs. And they said, well, you have 1 month to apply for this program. And so we developed the community solar proposal and submitted it. And the response was, well, we actually don't have the legal team to review the application for our own program. And that really ticked the customer off. And he said, well, I'd rather just go off grid instead of giving y'all any more money. And there was some personal motivation in going off grid for that. And what we wanted to do was review lithium ion and flooded lead acid and look at other kinds of, the higher end lithium iron phosphate battery. And then we also looked into a nickel iron battery, which is, I would say nickel iron is flooded lead acid type. It's not flooded lead acid, but it's you have to water the battery, maintain the battery similar to flooded lead acid. And so we modeled a few different sizes of battery banks, and we'll get into what drove, like, why are we doing industrial FLA at 122 kilowatt hours versus like a solar or renewable FLA battery at a smaller size. And some of this nuance just comes from, what is the most cost-effective size within a given manufacturer's product offering. Maybe their largest, most powerful battery is not the one that they make the most of, and so just your manufacturing volumes will make, for one particular manufacturer's industrial FLA product line, their most bang for their buck is a battery that results in 122 kilowatt hours, whereas a different manufacturer's product line, the most bang for the buck results in something that's 105 kilowatt hours. Then we looked at the Tesla Powerwall 2, and then a Sony lithium iron phosphate battery. And then we also looked at the Iron Edison nickel iron battery. And we learned a lot of very interesting stuff. The cheapest battery technology was what was referred to as a premium line flooded lead acid. In fact, in this discussion, I came across a solar installer who says, I don't even go for the premium line. I go for the golf cart, just very cheap, not really intended for being used off-grid golf cart batteries that might get as cheap as $90 a kilowatt hour. And since then, this product line from the manufacturer has been discontinued. They're trying to push people on to more premium line batteries. And I said, well, why do you do that? And he says, well, I really do tiny house off-grid systems. And what I find is that A, my customers can't afford the more expensive batteries. B, these industrial sized flooded lead acid are so heavy that just transporting them to the job site becomes an issue. Whereas golf cart batteries, you might have to do a lot of wiring, and you have to might take a couple of trips out to the job site to get all the batteries there, but you can actually pick them up and move them. So there are some logistical issues. And he said, with the tiny house customers, they adjust their lifestyle around their battery and their solar array. So, maybe doing a starter battery that gets replaced in a few years. Maybe the batteries are cheaper down the line. We kind of already mentioned the starter battery concept. Anyway, that's more for do-it-yourselfers if you're thinking about, powering your kid's tree house or something like that. That's more of the low-end golf cart types. So we looked at this premium FLA, and there's actually quite a difference in cost within flooded lead acid itself. And so, we look at this depth of discharge. We're going to get into reading cycle charts and stuff just in a minute. But what I want to point out is here we're doing 122 kilowatt hours, and because of that, it's the same load, it's the same house that we're trying to power, and so this 122 kilowatt hour battery bank only has an average depth of discharge of 20%, whereas this larger battery, or this smaller battery of 105 kilowatt hours, has an average depth of discharge of 30%. So that's just it's the same load either way. That's just a function of system size. If the client couldn't afford to buy a $25,000 battery, they might be forced to buy this $16,000 battery. But the difference, the reason why this industrial FLA battery costs $210 a kilowatt hour, whereas the premium FLA line costs $160, is that the industrial FLA line is rated for far more cycles at a 20% depth of discharge than the premium FLA battery is rated for at a 30% depth of discharge. And so basically, to get this last number, the levelized cost of storage, you would look at how much are you cycling your battery on an average basis. What is the cycle rating of that battery? So you take how many kilowatt hours you're drawing out of the battery and how many cycles it's warranted for, and that'll give you a dollar per kilowatt hour levelized cost of stored energy. And so this is how much the battery is actually storing at once, and this is how much total energy is coming out of the battery over its total life, the cost of the battery divided by the total energy output. And so what we basically see is, and this should not be a surprise to anyone, you get what you pay for. And so the cheaper upfront cost lead acid battery costs more in the long run to cycle than the more expensive lead acid technology, that costs less to cycle. So in other words, you spend more money on a more expensive battery within the same chemistry type, and then at the end of the day, it saves you money. That's the same thing comparing a Tesla Powerwall 2 lithium ion battery to the Sony lithium iron phosphate battery. The Tesla Powerwall 2 has a higher total cycle life than the higher end lithium iron phosphate battery. But that said, the capital requirement to buy this lithium iron phosphate battery, sure, it might be 50% less in terms of total cycles cost compared to FLA, but it's a $95,000 battery versus $25,000. There's just how much can you really afford to spend? And furthermore, this is a frozen upfront capital requirement. We're not even getting into the fact that it might be more cost effective to go with FLA today and lithium iron tomorrow rather than doing lithium iron today. I would only do this $1,400 a kilowatt hour lithium iron battery if I absolutely had to, like if I'm trying to power the International Space Station, not just my cabin in the woods. Okay, so the Tesla Powerwall 2 is rated in this configuration. We went with 67 kilowatt hours worth. Came out to be about $400 a kilowatt hour at the end of the day. The difference is you can actually use all of that kilowatt hour capacity on a daily basis. Whereas with the flooded lead acid, sure, if I had to, I could discharge all 122 kilowatt hours worth. But when we get into how batteries degrade in a minute, what we'll see is that the battery manufacturers give you a operating range where they say, we don't really want you to discharge the battery more than this much on a daily cycle. In other words, you have the storage capacity there if you need it, but you're not really ever using it. Whereas you can get away with a smaller battery that you're using as a deeper cycle on a regular basis, the danger being that if you run out of power, you don't have it to use, whereas you would if you went with a larger, cheaper battery bank that's more expensive to use in the long run. And so the lithium iron phosphate battery, with 42 kilowatt hours, we just determined that was too small. and we'll get into how we did that in just a minute. Kind of an interesting option was this nickel iron battery. And it's basically, the story is you can deep cycle it down to 80%. It has a very long life, and it actually resulted in the lowest total life cycle cost. And this is how many cycles it was rated for at that depth of discharge. So it actually costs less than the lithium iron phosphate battery and is rated for around the same, actually more cycles at an 80% depth of discharge. And when we got down to it, we were going to choose between the industrial FLA and the nickel iron. And, it was the capital cost where the client said, I'd rather have a 11-year battery rather than a 30-year battery. I don't want a starter battery. I don't want a battery that I'm going to have to replace in 5 years, but I don't want a 30-year battery either. I'd rather see what the technology is going to be like at the end of the line. And also nickel iron is, I would say, more for more experimental, industrial FLA batteries are used all the time for forklifts, and there's a whole industry built around it, whereas there's really only one nickel iron battery manufacturer in the US at least. Okay, how does the battery work? I just want to note that there's kind of a rock star of the battery industry. There's a Canadian professor, and he has a great YouTube lecture that I've posted the link on. I posted this link because it's not just a lecture. This link will give you the transcript of the lecture as well, so you can just read through it if you want. And what got him a job at Tesla after he released this lecture online was that what he discovered is, we think of that there's a lot of guess and check in terms of battery life, and that you can monitor a battery voltage and see how long it takes to charge and kind of guess how much life is left in the battery at that point. But what he realized is that you could actually accurately predict the life of a battery if your testing resolution of your testing equipment was tremendously more powerful than just taking a voltmeter and a electrician's clamp meter and measuring the voltage and temperature and energy in and energy out. The problem is the resolution of the test equipment. And so if you can, really go and examine the anode of a battery under a electron microscope, you can actually image, how much the damage has been done to that cathode and, or anode, and batteries fail for real reasons. And so he went and developed some high resolution battery testing equipment, which Tesla found useful for running experiments with different kinds of catalysts for their batteries. So we'll get into that in a minute. And then the software that we're going to be running some simulations in, Energy Toolbase, it's kind of the market leader for battery economic modeling. And so I spoke with their business development head, and I asked them, what kind of battery technologies do you see most commonly being modeled? And he says, mainly I see lithium ion, not much lead acid, not much lithium iron phosphate, but, he mostly sees lithium ion. So I'm a big kind of, I'd say, evangelist for industrial flooded lead acid. But the information that, the number one, the guy who would know with load side demand management is telling me he really only sees lithium ion. So, I'm not trying to say that I'm the expert on this. What I would say is the industrial flooded lead acid manufacturers really haven't sized up demand management for cost savings yet. They're still more on the forklift market, not, looking at this emerging market within energy management. And so, what happens when you have a battery being cycled is you have an electrolyte and you have a cathode and an anode. And when a battery is cycling, it's pressing a positively charged lithium ion out of the anode and passing it through the electrolyte onto the cathode. And that also at the same time induces an electron flow through the battery. And where batteries fail is this barrier between the anode and the electrolyte. So where the lithium ion is coming out of, what happens is that whether this is a mesh screen or a flat plate, it eventually degrades. And you measure the mass of a cathode and an anode under a failed battery, and the anode changes by about 10%, and the cathode doesn't change very much, by about 3%. And so what that means is, like, inside the anode, it has still, a lot of mass that could degrade if somehow we were to put a whole bunch of plates into an electrolytic mixture and increase the surface area of the anode. But what happens is that barrier between the electrolyte and the anode develops particulate that then plates the anode and fills in the holes inside the anode that the ion could be squeezed through. And as soon as those holes get covered, the ion can no longer come out of the anode, and so your chemical reaction stops. And so what Tesla is looking at is it possible to change the electrolytic mixture so that instead of this chemical reaction inducing a plaque that covers the anode, instead of producing a particulate, could we produce, say, a gas? And so that there's less solidification, or a liquid that gets mixed into the electrolytic mixture. And so rather than plating the anode, can we have, just by varying the electrolyte slightly, can that change the plating reaction to result in less plating? And then the R&D end of things, they've demonstrated anodes and cathodes that can be cycled 100,000 times without failing, but still in kind of the research and development ends of things. And so where like Panasonic and Tesla, what they're hoping is to reduce the cost of lithium ion by essentially reducing that plating buildup on the anode so that they can have more cycles out of the same battery. Batteries are impacted by temperature. And what one of Jeff Dahn's discoveries was that the battery, the longer that the anode is exposed to the lithium ion reaction being pressed out of the lithium ion, it's more a function of time rather than how many lithium ions are coming out of the anode. And so, we have this idea that the like rapid charging a lead acid battery is bad and you want to trickle charge it. That more has to do with the sealing of the battery itself and the temperature accumulation from the inefficiency of the process limiting how quickly you can charge and discharge that battery. Lithium-ion batteries are more efficient. You can charge and discharge them more rapidly. And then what he's saying is that for the same amount of power, the quicker the charge and discharge process, the less buildup you have on that anode. And so a lithium-ion battery that can be charged and discharged more quickly than, say, lead acid is going to have a longer life out of it. With that in mind, how do you give a battery a 10-year or 30-year life, given that even some of these battery companies are only a couple years old? Well, what they do is rapid cycle the battery. So they'll charge it over a 40-minute iteration and discharge it over a 20-minute iteration and use that to estimate its useful life. But a battery that is actually charged and discharged not over a 40-minute or 20-minute iteration, but is charged and discharged, say solar, might be charging it over 5 hours. And off-grid residential, you might be discharging the battery over a period of 20 hours. Or if you're doing demand management, you might be discharging it over a period of 2 or 4 hours. That is that the batteries are going to have actually less life than what this 40-minute, 20-minute charge discharge cycle rating is indicating. And he believes that by changing up the electrolyte of lithium-ion batteries, that they could potentially increase the life of these lithium-ion batteries rather substantially. Okay, so how are batteries impacted by temperature? Well, the hotter that a battery gets, what we have is the remaining charge. And so what we see here is a room temperature battery. We have cycles and remaining capacity. And so if the battery is operating at a higher temperature, we actually see some degradation in its remaining capacity. So hot temperatures are bad for battery life. And in his lecture, he goes into a story between the difference between the Nissan, or it might have been the Chevy Bolt, and the Tesla. And it was a difference of one does temperature management of the batteries and the others did not do temperature management of the batteries. And it was that lack of temperature management that, out on the road, the car heats up, the battery heats up, and the batteries exposed to that higher temperature fail. Now, that said, cold temperatures, while it might result in less degradation on the battery, the colder the temperature goes, the battery shrinks in capacity as well. In fact, with flooded lead acid batteries, if you get below freezing temperatures, you have to keep them at least 50% charged, or else the electrolyte begins to freeze. And so the temperature affects batteries in different ways. Higher end temperatures will degrade the battery faster. Colder temperatures will simply reduce the available capacity of the battery because you don't want to discharge it so much that the electrolyte freezes up. And so whether or not you're using a lithium-ion battery, which is more temperature sensitive than lead acid, you want to, if you can, regulate the temperature of the battery, whether or not it's flooded lead acid or lithium-ion. The one easy way to do that is, say, if you're using a flooded lead acid battery, you would want to put in a heater next to the battery and say, okay, in the wintertime, if my battery is at full voltage and I still have this surplus electricity, I want to turn that heater on and heat up the concrete floor and the thermal mass in my battery box or battery room so that, overnight, the temperature of that room stays higher than freezing. Put that inefficient surplus energy to work. It's not to say that the batteries can't take high temperatures, but if you can air condition them, they will last substantially longer. So if you have the ability to put your batteries inside of a room in a conditioned space rather than a box outside the building, it's in your best interest to do that. All right, so how did I calculate this data and these costs? Let's see what time it is. We're running up on our break. We'll take a break in about 2 minutes, and then when we come back, we'll get into our modeling. Why don't we take a look at the Tesla Powerwall? Here we have the Tesla Powerwall. Initially, when the Powerwall came out, it was advertised as a 7 kilowatt hour Powerwall, and then they dropped the rating down to 6.4 kilowatt hours. They say, oh, you can cycle a lithium-ion battery 100%, but on my phone, when my phone is discharged all the way down to 0, I can hold the button down and I see the little 0 charge light come up on the phone. So I think, well, doesn't that mean there's actually a little bit of power left in that battery? Actually, lithium-ion batteries, if you discharge them all the way down to 0, it's very bad for the battery. So Tesla retains, in lithium-ion batteries, you retain a little bit of charge just to make sure it doesn't go all the way down to 0. And so rather than keep that 7 kilowatt hour rating and say you could discharge it down to 95%, they just changed the list rating of the battery and kept that 100% depth of discharge. Now, just because I have a 6.4 kilowatt hour battery doesn't mean that my inverter can output 6.4 kilowatt hours. And to this extent, there may be a little bit of a Apple approach to inverter manufacturing, where the Tesla is saying, we're going to give you, twice as much battery capacity as we have coming out of our inverter on our Tesla Powerwall, so that there's no way you can discharge the battery in 1 hour, that you have to stay within the 2-hour rating of the battery that we're giving you. You're not able to kind of supercharge your battery performance, which is a feature that if you want to be able to damage the battery through rapid discharging beyond what it's listed for, that is a solution that you would have to piece together by separating the inverter manufacturer from the battery manufacturer. And at that point, the battery manufacturer may not honor their warranty. They may ask you for the voltage rating and temperature logs of the battery and say, oh, you were running this battery out of spec, and we understand why you were doing that for cost savings, but it voids our warranty when you're using it in this manner. For Tesla, they're giving you a 10-year warranty on the battery. They actually warrant the battery by the total energy output. So they actually warrant the battery for a certain number of kilowatt hours. They have a 92.5% round trip efficiency, whereas lead acid might be more like an 80% round trip efficiency. So, it'll, out of the energy in and energy out, you're going to save and retain a lot more of it with the Tesla Powerwall. We see our voltage being between 350, 450 volts. And then we get to the current output, and it's only 10 amps. And, you look at your breaker and your wall, and your electric service panel is full of 20 amp breakers. And they're not always using 20 amps. Usually they might be using 8 or 9 amps or 5 amps or less. But what that means is just one Tesla Powerwall is not going to be able to run a home off grid. At the very least, it's going to run a critical load, or maybe it'll output enough of a signal to turn your solar array on so you can get additional amperage from your solar array. But the idea that I'm just going to go and buy one Tesla Powerwall and have that be able to provide backup power in emergency, it's only going to be able to provide a very limited amount of power in an emergency. What you would have to do to get more power out of it is parallel a bunch of Tesla Powerwalls together. Let's see. Now they've iterated their design. They're now at the Tesla Powerwall 2, which is basically twice the size. So we get a 13.5 kilowatt hour battery with a 7 kilowatt output. They suggest that it costs $5,500 before the install. And so you divide 5,500 by 13 and a half, and you get to about $407 per kilowatt hour of storage capacity. You know, they give it a 37,800 kilowatt hour warranty, and that makes it very easy to develop this lifetime levelized cost where you can just divide the cost of the battery by how much energy is the warranted output, and that gives you 14 and a half cents. And this is where the concept of energy arbitrage falls apart. Because if I look at, say, the Southern company's time of day rates in Atlanta, Georgia. You know, they might give me 27 cents as a peak rate, and they might give me an 8-cent off-peak rate. But it's going to cost me 14 and a half cents effectively to charge at 8 cents and discharge when I would be billed at 27 cents. And so if my differential is about 20 cents and my cost is about 15 cents, you know, yes, indeed, I am saving 5 cents a kilowatt hour during that time. And, you know, if that were available for me every single day of the year, I might be able to get an 8-year payback with my Powerwall. And so when your energy arbitrage opportunity is about twice the cost of the battery, that's when energy arbitrage begins to make sense. In California or Hawaii, the buyback rate might be in Hawaii it's 0 and the retail price might be 50 cents. So absolutely buying Tesla Powerwalls for energy arbitrage makes sense in Hawaii. In California, the retail rate might be 30 cents during peak times, and the buyback rate might only be 11 cents during peak times. And so I would have to get a battery that has, you know, like if I wanted to do energy arbitrage with flooded lead acid, and my differential between peak and off peak is a 20-cent differential, and it costs me 20 cents to do energy arbitrage with lead acid, it falls apart. I'm just spinning my wheels. I'm not saving any money. I would have to go into a more expensive battery technology for energy arbitrage to generate any sort of payback. And so the idea of day trading your electricity does not work with lead acid. It's too expensive. If you're just going after these time of day energy only rates. But even if you have an opportunity for a very expensive energy only arbitrage opportunity, what you also need is for that opportunity to present itself every single day of the year, as it would in Hawaii, where every single day of the year you're not allowed to export power onto the grid. But if I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I have a time of use rate structure that might have a large differential between peak and off peak, well, then you read the terms and conditions and it says, well, the time of use rate structure is not applicable to weekends or holidays. And so if I take out the weekends, that's taking out 2/7 of my opportunity. And all of a sudden that 8-year payback gets pushed back to, 11 or 12-year payback. And then if my peak months and that peak time of use rate is only available for the 4 hottest months of the year, if it's only available for June, the middle of May to the middle of September, and the rest of the months are defined as off peak, and the time of day differential may not exist or may only be 10 cents, and so it doesn't make sense to cycle my battery at that time. If it could take what would be an 8-year payback on a daily basis and make it a 33-year payback simply because it's only available for 4 months out of the year during the week and not on the weekends. So it even using, like the Tesla Powerwall 2, which is kind of the leading cost-effective lithium-ion battery tech, if you are willing to pay for it and get on the wait list and find a certified installer. They have a very protected supply chain. LG Chem is a little bit more expensive, but it's also more available. So you might find that there's more installers willing to work at a lower rate with the LG Chem than with Tesla, meaning it might come out in the wash. But it basically just says that unless you're in a market where you have a daily time of day differential of 28 cents or more, using your battery to day trade electricity, it's not worth it. It would be better to sell back to the grid at avoided cost than to day trade electricity with your solar battery in most cases for residential type rate structures. And for those reasons, the real economic solar batteries are either an off-grid where you have to use them, or demand management where you can go after these demand charges. But for most energy-only rate structures, the battery is not really there to save the customer any money. And so what that means is that the Tesla Powerwall may simply just be there to provide backup power during an emergency. And since it really can't provide more than 10 amps, the question becomes, well, how much is that backup power worth? And at that point, it may only be worthwhile if you already have on-site solar that needs to be started up. And so is a Tesla Powerwall going to replace a backup generator? The question may boil down to, well, does the client already own a solar array or not? The Tesla Powerwall would be kind of a bad option for customers in lieu of a generator for backup power unless they need it to start up another asset that's already on site. But looking at the Powerwall 2, for demand management, we get a little bit of a different story. We take that same Powerwall 2, and it actually has a 5 kilowatt output, not a 7 kilowatt. So I guess I analyzed it a little wrong, and I think this has to do with its continuous output rating, where it can output 7 kilowatts, but maybe that's the 30-minute output instead of the 2-hour rating. So you look at its $5,500 installed cost, and it's $407 per kilowatt hour of storage, and it's 5 kilowatt continuous output capacity. Let's say I have a demand charge of $20 a kilowatt, which is, that's what my demand charge is out in the countryside here in Mississippi. It's higher than it's about the high end of demand charges, but it's not hard to find. That graph we looked at yesterday, you can find these $20 kilowatt demand charges throughout the country. Let's say that I could use my Tesla Powerwall in the most efficient manner possible. And so thinking back to that chart, we're just shaving off the very tip of the top of the power curve. So if I can save at 5 kilowatts a month at $20 a kilowatt hour, it really doesn't matter how long I run the battery. I could run it for 1 hour a month at the max peak and save $20 per kilowatt, or I could run it for 10 hours and be shaving off, at the max peak, and I'd still only be able to save $20 per kilowatt total. And so at $5 a kilowatt for $20 a month for 12 months a year, at a maximum, I could save $1,000 a year. And so if I only need to run that for, 1 hour a day, or even less, I could get a 5-year payback. But if I need to double the size because my load requires me to run the battery for 3 hours a day, and I need to double the size so that I have enough capacity for it, then my payback goes to 11 years. If I'm trying to do load leveling for 6 hours a day and I need 4 times the capacity, then my payback is not 5 years, it's 20 years. And so this is to say that getting in on the as a sales strategy, you might find that if your client is capital constrained, but they're asking you about a project, you can say, well, with these batteries, let's just go after the very tip of your demand curve and get a good cost-effective payback, and then all of the data that we gather through monitoring your electricity and showing and demonstrating the cost effectiveness of this, batteries are going to drop in price down the road so that we can expand the project later on. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 15-minute break. And when we come back from break, we're going to look a little bit more at battery spec sheets and explore this explore the battery cycle chart and kind of explain what's going on in these curves. And then we're also going to do some modeling and kind of show you how we size the battery bank for our off-grid home, and also get into a simulation for commercial sizing as well. So, we still have a lot of content left to go through. It's 12:45. Why don't we take a 15-minute break? We'll start back up at the top of the hour. So, let's take 15 minutes, and we'll start back up right at 2 p.m. Eastern time. See you then. We'll pick back up in about 2 minutes. All right. Welcome back. We had a question from James that says, why is the Tesla Powerwall warranty given in kilowatt hours? And that has to do with the battery cycling. So we're going to take a look at some lead acid battery sheets, which are used for sizing lead acid battery cycles and generating kilowatt hour output. But coming back to our previous chart on cost effectiveness, what we see is the kilowatt hour output coming from a Tesla Powerwall. And so to generate this levelized cost of storage, we just took the cost of the Powerwall and divided by the number of cycles coming out of it to give us this 15 cents per kilowatt hour output. You don't get the number of kilowatt hours under warranty coming from traditional lead acid. Instead, what you get is a chart that tells you how deeply you can discharge the battery and how many cycles you'll get at that level of discharge. And so what's kind of interesting about the higher end lithium ion technology is that the monitoring systems are much more robust. And when we think about how batteries corrode, the depth of discharge in cycles is a lot more ambiguous than just giving it a hard kilowatt hour number, which is more appropriately reflects its usage. Maybe in a forklift operation, you're utilizing your forklift on a fairly regular basis, but just seasonal differences in temperature will mean that sometimes you're discharging your battery at a different level in the spring or fall than you would in the winter or summer. And so it's the warranty on the Powerwall is measured in kilowatt hours to reflect I guess a more accurate monitoring, where the Tesla is going to be monitoring every single kilowatt hour and counting every single kilowatt hour that comes out of it. We're gonna get into this in more detail. I just wanted to give you a link of one of the batteries. We actually did not end up going with a Trojan battery. We went with a forklift battery manufacturer instead. So here's a list of some top battery vendors. My guess is from the time I made this slide, Panasonic has probably moved up. The Tesla and Panasonic have a alliance where the Tesla battery really is a Panasonic battery. And so what we see is the gigawatt factory for Tesla, 35 gigawatt hours. It's supposed to be something like the largest building in the world or something like that. It's supposed to be fully operational in 2020. BYD is a Brazilian company, and they have a similar gigawatt factory that's supposed to come online in 2020. You know, LG Chem is kind of the market leader right now, and they're kind of the first out of the gate with a gigawatt factory that kind of pales in comparison to where Tesla wants to be. But it's not like LG Chem is going to rest on their laurels. You know, but what I really wanted to illustrate with this slide is that, you know, every 2 years the capacity of lithium ion batteries is increasing, you know, exponentially. And so what the lithium ion battery market's going to look like, you know, 10 years from now, you know, it might be like what it really reminds me of what the solar industry looked like, you know, from 2000 to 2010, where the main difference in solar over that time frame was that silicon refiners, you know, just started to determine that there was a new application for refined silicon, where previously up to that point, all the refined silicon went into making computer chips, and then they started to heavily invest in solar dedicated silicon refining in the early 2000s, and then that resulted in the price crashing in the late 2000s. You know, similarly with lithium ion batteries, you know, now we have, you know, not just using the batteries for portable electronics, but also using the batteries for stationary generator replacements and also electric vehicles. And so we're starting to see the exponential capacity come to market. As far as you know, shovel-ready products, in addition to the Tesla Powerwall and LG Chem, some other brands to look into. Sonnen battery is kind of the leader with lithium iron phosphate. So just if you know, they market themselves as a higher end product. So if you want that higher end, Sonnen's good to look at. And then Mercedes as well has lithium ion batteries on the market. So there are some synergies between making electric vehicles and just stationary batteries. You know, Tesla already says that the hard cost of their lithium ion battery is at $190 a kilowatt hour. So, you know, we're here in 2018, and you know, it looks like Tesla is exceeding the forecast of coming down in their price. Of course, by the time you buy the inverter and all the other components, you're at that $400 a kilowatt hour price point. I'm going to skip over these trends so we get into our modeling. So finally, we get into, let's say, an off-grid home. So I had a client come to me and he says, JR, I'm building a house. The power company is charging me $20,000 if I wanted to bring power out to the property. You know, I kind of want to just go off-grid. So what would it cost to go off-grid? And it's kind of, you know, this is not a hippie living in a yurt. This is a doctor with a wife and 2 kids in middle school. So the last thing I want to do is undersize a system and have them run out of power. And, you know, then I have to figure out what to do at that point. It's useful to have interval data. We were talking about this yesterday. You know, on your electric bill, you get the volume under the curve. But what we can see is based on, you know, what season it is. You know, here in Aqua, we have air conditioning load. And so, your air conditioning load is going to increase throughout the day and then maybe decrease as temperatures drop at night. Whereas heating loads, generally you see a high heating load in the morning, and then you're just keeping the building warm throughout the day. And, depending on what you're using for heating can really impact this load profile. The doctor was saying, I'm going to use wood pellet heating. Mississippi, that's your trees is pretty much the thing that grows here. And so there's a lot of trees around, and wood pellet furnaces are not uncommon. And if we can get rid of all that heating load, then our electric demand is going to be substantially less in the wintertime. And so what I said is, well, we're gonna design your home based off your current electric use. And he says, well, right now I use electric heat. I'm gonna move into wood pellet heat. And I say, well, that's fine. What we'll know is that by sizing it off your current use, we're gonna have a conservative design. And shoveling wood pellets into your heating stove every day does not sound like something that's completely enjoyable. So if we design your home now, then it might be that you don't really need to rely on those wood pellets for heat. It might be that we can heat the home during the day with solar, and then your wood pellets are there as a secondary source of heat. And so what is interesting about these load profiles, this was generated using a solar design software called Aurora. And my parents who live in Oklahoma have a very similar tool just within their AEP electric utility account, where if you know what region of the country you're in, so you know what the seasonal temperature differences are, and you know what your month-to-month electric use is, if you know what your total volume is under the curb, while your actual energy use may appear spiky and have some hysteresis in it, you can still fill out, and what this is, it's too small to read, but it's a survey of all of the electrical appliances in the home. So it's, are you going to use electric heat or not? Do you have an air conditioner? How are you doing water heating? Is that gas or electric? What kind of light bulbs do you have? When I did this survey for my parents' home, they were still on your incandescent bulbs, and it's kind of a spec-built house where there's recessed lighting every 6 feet throughout their whole house, and you turn the lights on and you can feel the temperature change from the temperature of the light bulbs. And it turned out that half of their electric bill was coming from their light bulbs. So they got some LEDs for Christmas. But the thing is, if you know the volume under the curb, and you know your region, and you know the appliances that are in the home, you can, and what Aurora does is it just assumes a load profile based on the kind of heating that you have in your home, the kind of electric appliances in your home, and then it just shapes the volume to match your electric readout on what you say the volume is. So you can kind of, if you don't have interval data for your home, you can kind of hone in on a guess. But it is just a guess. The best thing to do is to actually obtain this interval data from either your utility or from the electric service panel monitor. I didn't have this data for my client, but I did have his electric bill, and so I pulled up my, the square footage of the new home and my parents' home were about the same. And I said, all right, well, Tulsa has a little bit more extreme weather than Starkville, Mississippi, and so I'm assuming that hold on one second. Let me turn that off. So I'm assuming that I'm still up. Okay. So I'm assuming that the demand in my parents' home in Tulsa is going to be greater than the doctor's home in Starkville, and their square footage was about the same. They were, using, my parents had gas heat, and so the wood pellet heat was about the same. And so I pulled up their electric bill, and because they have their interval data, and I go through the entire year for their 15-minute interval data, and shows their residential home gets up to 14.5 kilowatts of demand on July 31st, in the morning, right when the temperature is starting to elevate and that air conditioner really clicks on. And so what I'm looking for a oversized home, and this we oversized the off-grid home because we had the budget to do so, and we were going for a worry-free atmosphere. We probably could have gotten away with a system that was half the size of what we installed, but we wanted to give him the feeling of like he was not living off grid. So whereas you could get away with maybe just having one inverter and going with one 6.8 kilowatt inverter that had a surge capacity that was substantially larger than its continuous output. And so this one 6.8 kilowatt inverter could have a surge capacity that would have accommodated a 15 or 30 minute 14 kilowatt surge. The main thing is we went with two inverters because, if one failed, he would have been out of electricity while the inverter was being serviced. We didn't want him to go without electricity. So we looked at the surge capacity ratings of two 5.5 kilowatt inverters that could surge up to 14 minutes versus two 6.8 kilowatt inverters that could surge up to 17. We could have gone with the undersized inverter, but when we went and looked at the pricing, the slightly larger inverter was only slightly more expensive, so we erred on the side of being conservative. We've talked about this data a little bit already, so I'm gonna skip over it for the time being. What you're trying to do. This is back on demand management, so I might come back to this slide in a moment. We're gonna look at all this stuff more on commercial load profiling, so I'm gonna stick to the residential case study for now. So this stuff probably should have come a little bit later in the program. So let me just stick on track for this residential case study. Then we'll finish out with the commercial case study. So when you do a PV watts solar production estimate, a lot of people go and they put in their system size and location of PV watts, and they get that solar production estimate, and they get how much each month the array is going to produce. But you don't want to neglect the fact that you can go down at the end of PV watts and export the hourly production data. And so all we had from the client going into this off-grid design was their monthly electric bill. So he said that, in the month of January, he used 1,500 kilowatt hours. And then in the month of June and July and August, he used, over 2,000 kilowatt hours. But we didn't have any interval data. But what we could do is calculate how many days were in each month and go from monthly data into daily averages. And so we see that in January, he's using about 48 kilowatt hours a day. In June, July, and August, he's using about 60 to 70 kilowatt hours a day. And at that point, we go into our PV watts data, and instead of just doing daily averages, and why don't I go ahead and run a quick simulation using PV watts. So I'm going back into Google, and I'm Googling PV watts. Going into Starkville, Mississippi. No, I'm pulling up my. Remember, this is local weather data that PV Watts is drawing from, and not only am I looking at say, okay, well he used a total of 17,000 kilowatt hours in a year, and so if I do my kind of magic ratio of 1.4 kilowatt hours per month, I can see he's using 17,100 kilowatt hours a year. If I was trying to zero out his electric bill under an unlimited net metering policy, I'd say, okay, well, you need about a 12 kilowatt solar array to accommodate your needs. But the problem is that's for annual. What I'm really looking for is that every single month his monthly electric use is zeroed out. And so what I can see is that in based off my PV Watts estimate, let's go back and create a little scaler here. 1 kilowatt, and do roof mount, south facing, although that's not the only configuration. What I can see is that my production in the summertime is larger than my production in the wintertime, and my production in spring is also, pretty good too. When I look at his monthly totals, I see that his consumption in the summertime is larger than his consumption in the wintertime, but actually in spring and in fall, his consumption goes down. You're not really running the heater, nor are you running the air conditioner. And so in the spring and in the fall, he would only need an 8 kilowatt array and not a 12 kilowatt array to zero out his bill. But in the summertime, the production of the array increases and his consumption increases. And so in the summertime, he would need more like a 16 kilowatt array. And it's the wintertime that is particularly difficult. And that's when he would need like an 18 kilowatt array. And now that's just at the end of the month, your battery remains fully charged. But what we have to remember is that this is a day-to-day process because your weather cycles are a daily variance. You could go 5 or 6 days of overcast weather. So it's not just trying to settle up at the end of the month because I can't store a month's worth of electricity. That's too expensive even at $200 a kilowatt hour. That would mean at 1,500 kilowatt hours, I'd be spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars on a month worth of energy storage. It just wouldn't make sense. I need to store only a couple of days, maybe even less than a day of energy. And so, even though I'm saying that, okay, in the wintertime, I need at least an 18 kilowatt array, to be conservative, I'm going to do even 20% larger than that. And basically what you get to is a conservatively sized solar array for off-grid living is substantially larger than that if you're just doing like a net metered solar array. And so what this means is, this is just like our starting point where we're saying we need around a 22 kilowatt array. Now, another thing that's interesting about this is normally you would say, okay, well, if I'm doing a 22 kilowatt array, my inverter needs to be 20% undersized. And so I would need that to be maybe on like a 16 kilowatt inverter for a 22 kilowatt array. But we also have to remember that the real constraint is in the winter time. And so we can go into our PV Watts hourly data and see that in the winter time, why don't we go ahead and extract the data on an hourly basis, open it up and take a look. Hold on 1 second. Let me zoom in. So here's our PV watts hourly data for my region, line of latitude, longitude for a 1 kilowatt array at a 20-degree tilt on the roof facing due south. And in the solar class, we get into how all of this data is really useful for understanding temperature and environmental conditions, and going into verifying if your array is producing as much as it should. Things like rooftop temperature you can get from PV watts. But why don't I make this a little bit more simple? In this column D, we have beam irradiance and direct irradiance. So this would be like beam irradiance would be sunny and diffuse irradiance would be cloudy. And so here we are on January 1st at midnight. Well, there's no solar irradiance in the sky. And then we get into the day, and what we see is it's all diffuse irradiance and no direct irradiance. This is a completely pea soup overcast day. And our solar array, our 1 kilowatt solar array, up at the end of it, we have our AC system output. Our solar array is producing 140 watts out of 1,000. So we're producing 15% of the sticker rating of our array. Now, that's not the whole picture. Let's scroll down to a day where we actually get some direct irradiance. So here we are at high noon, and it's a mostly sunny day. We do see some clouds or humidity or whatever in the sky diffusing some of the sunlight, but it's mostly direct. We might check the next day to see if the diffuse irradiance goes back down, but what we see is the direct irradiance goes away again. And so this is kind of like the sunniest day of the month right here. So under our sunniest condition, we're producing 440 watts. And so what I really just want to illustrate is if we divide, the 143 watts we get on the pea soup day divided by what the power that we get on the sunny day, is that the pea soup day, you're still actually producing some power. You're producing not 15% of what you would get on that sunny day. You're producing about 1/3 of what you would get on that sunny day. Coming back to our question of oversizing then, normally I would do like a 12 kilowatt array to net meter this, and that might go on a 9 kilowatt or a 10 kilowatt inverter. Here I have an 18 kilowatt array. What size of an inverter do I really need for that 18 kilowatts? Well, I don't need, if I divide by 20% and say like that might be on a 15 kilowatt array, I actually don't need a 15 kilowatt array for that. Because again, remember the days of the month that I'm drawing down my battery bank are those overcast days when my array is producing about 1/3 of what it would be on a sunny day. And so instead of going like a 1 to 1.2 ratio between my inverter size and my array size, my inverter to array ratio might actually be, I might put a 10 kilowatt charge controller on the 15 kilowatt array. It might be closer to 1 to 1.5, because I'm not really trying to capture every kilowatt hour that comes out of the array on the sunniest day of the month. All I'm trying to do is make sure that I have enough juice on the cloudiest day of the month. So I could put an 18 kilowatt array on a 10 kilowatt output capacity, because on that cloudy day, that 18 kilowatt array is only going to be at 6 or 7 kilowatts. And so, substantially, unlike with a batteryless system where you have the solar array is about 20% larger than the inverter output, on a battery system, the output may be 50% undersized instead of 20% undersized. So it's the charge controller we selected ended up having a 4.8 kilowatt output capacity. And that 4.8 kilowatt output capacity, you could get away with doing 2 relatively small circuits of solar panels before you get up to 4.8 kilowatts. But we actually ended up doing 3 circuits of panels and putting, like, it was around, I don't know, 8 kilowatts of solar onto this 4.8 kilowatt charge controller, because we didn't need all 8 kilowatts to be working in spring or in summer. What we needed is that 8 kilowatts to be working on the cloudiest day in the winter, at which point we were getting, not even up to the output capacity of the system. And so there's an opportunity for oversizing the DC capacity far beyond what a solar designer might be used to for off-grid design. And for that reason, a charge controller that initially may appear to cost more because it has 3 input circuits instead of 1 or 2 may actually end up costing less, because you don't have to buy a whole bunch of extra material if you want to oversize the DC capacity of the array. So what we did is we went back to we got these daily totals of how much kilowatt hours he's consuming each day. And then we went back into our PV watts model, and we remember that this is the system output of our solar array in terms of watts each day. So instead of doing a 1 kilowatt system, we did a 22 kilowatt system. So it's a scalar. So we're just multiplying by 22 to give us the total watt output. And then we're dividing by 1,000 to give us the kilowatt output. And so now we have, for every single hour of the day, for every single hour of the year, we have the kilowatt output capacity of our 22 kilowatt array. And so in Excel, we can go in and model that. And then at that point, we might have to go back there and assume that some of it's going to be clipped off. But again, on the days where we're experiencing clipping, it's not going to be a huge issue. And then on that point, we go and we say, okay, well, what size of a battery, or what's our load? And so we have our daily kilowatt hours consumed, where we're consuming 48 kilowatt hours a day. And now our PV watts is broken out by hours of the day. So you could assume an average load of 48 kilowatt hours a day divided by 24. But that really wouldn't be a great indicator of our true load, because we don't have an even amount every single day. But you can make an assumption and vary this hourly load coming out of your battery, and have that at least vary by the month, because you have your monthly totals. So you can go from your monthly electric bill to a daily kilowatt hour consumed, and then go into an hourly kilowatt hour consumed. And if you want to, you can reduce the amount that you're consuming at night and increase the amount that you're using during the day. At the same time, it's well, if you're using an average amount, all that's going to do is draw more power out of the batteries than what you're actually going to be drawing at if you're matching up some of your load to be when you're producing the solar. So going just with your hourly average for the day, for the month that you're in, really isn't the worst assumption you could make in the world. And so here we're assuming we're using like 2 kilowatt hours per hour. Here we're assuming we're going to be using more than that. In the summertime, we're going to be up closer to 70 divided by 30. We're going to be using, I don't know, 2.5 kilowatts per hour. And then we can, if we wanted to go even further into that, we could go and do our true interval data, but we don't have interval data in this case. And so what we do is we basically kind of take let's just assume we're drawing 2 kilowatts per hour for every single hour of the year, just to speed up the design exercise. This is our average hourly load in kilowatts. And this is our average hourly output. And so we take our output and we subtract our load, and then we keep summing it up for the whole year. So now we've drawn 4 kilowatt hours, now we've drawn 6, now we've drawn 8, 10, 12, 14. Now our sun's going to come back up, and so what we can see is that we're actually recharging the battery, and then we get all the way down to the last day of the year. And doing this commercially would be there must be some error in my formula here. Let's see. There, I'm adding it back up. So I'm staying at 130, 108, getting all the way back down. Okay, so now I've accumulated a surplus by the end. And so at this point, you have to say, okay, well, what is my minimum and what is my maximum? And my maximum is there. My minimum, what do I get all the way down to, is 329. And so what I can see is, in this very kind of inaccurate model, because I haven't gone in and replaced the load varying for each month and whatnot, but I can see that come on, what's going on here? Let's go back down to where I was negative. As I guess the springtime has come, but what I could do is go back and see, okay, what's the minimum number that I'm getting down to? And what we could see is that my minimum number I don't know where it's coming. We'll just find it manually. But here we are. Here we are right here. It's right here on January 14th. I've gotten to the point where, if I didn't have 329 kilowatt hours of power in my battery bank, I would be out of juice. And so I could go in and then assume that my starting point was a 329 kilowatt hour battery bank, or if I was trying to make sure that I only got down to an 80% depth of discharge, now I'd start out at a 411 kilowatt hour battery bank, and then at that point, that's my starting point. And now I'm kind of modeling how many kilowatt hours are coming in and out of my battery bank on a routine basis. And so you can create a very crude model between your monthly kilowatt hours and your hourly PV watts production to kind of hone in on what is an appropriate battery bank size for the array. Now, there's a few things you'd have to do. Is you'd have to go into this model and say, okay, well, if I'm at a 411 kilowatt hour battery bank, the instant that this goes above 411, you'd have to cut it off. That would basically saying you're producing surplus power. And so, in Excel, you would say, well, if your cell is greater than, your starting point, then you're going to get back to your starting point rather than continuing the formula, else you just use the formula and you go back and start modeling your battery point using the good brute force method. And then you could even chart your taking your total battery bank size and your other axis of the hours of the day and days of the year. You'd have to convert this into a little bit better granular data, but you will show you the end result. As we went and charted our 122 kilowatt hour battery bank for every hour of the day, every day of the year, and we can actually see the weather systems roll through. So here we have January through June, and we see that we're starting to go into some times where there's not enough sunlight for the array to charge back up. And we're getting down to about a 50% depth of discharge at this point, before the sun comes back and barely almost charges the array all the way up to the top, and then the clouds come back, and then we charge back up, and the clouds come back on a multi-day weather cycle. And then all of a sudden we get into the springtime, and we're just slamming the array all the way back up to the top of its battery capacity. And then we see as we get into the summertime, the demand starts to bring the battery back down, but our summertime cycles are not enough to really drag the battery down substantially. Then we would go back and say, well, okay, well, what if we added a generator to this? If I'm using a battery that is not rated for more than a 50% depth of discharge, how many times a year would I have to run my generator to protect my battery bank? And so, again, in our design, one consideration is, well, how often and how much do you want to rely on running that generator? In our case, our client didn't want to rely on running the generator at all. Now, when you do a flooded lead acid battery, it's also good to have a generator there just for battery maintenance. And so, that maintenance cycle, when you're cycling and using your batteries, the maintenance cycle might occur every 2 weeks. If you're not really using your batteries, the maintenance cycle might only be once a month. But if we're running a maintenance cycle with our generator every 2 weeks, while we're deep cycling our batteries, we say, okay, well, we're starting our generator in the month of January. We're going to be running our generator five to six times just to protect the battery bank, whereas we might only run the maintenance cycle twice or three times in that month. So we're, as long as we're timing our maintenance cycles with days where a cloud system has passed through over a 5-day long period, we're really not running our generator much more than we would normally be for maintaining the batteries. Here we have July roll around, and this was kind of surprising. The deepest depth of discharge we get to is not in December or January, but it's actually in July. This might have been when a hurricane rolled off the Gulf Coast. And so now we have a few days of thunderstorms with no sun, And because we have a huge air conditioning load, our battery starts getting drugged down, drugged down, and drugged down. And that's our 20% point, where the batteries are rated for no more than an 80% depth of discharge. That's how we sized the battery to be 122 kilowatt hours. As we said, okay, in this storm cycle in the summertime, our battery, in order to get to no more than an 80% depth of discharge, the top of this line here needed to be 122 kilowatt hours. And so that's how we got to 122. Now, in normal operation, because we have a generator on site, we're never going to get here. We're going to click the generator on before we get to that point. And so if we wanted to reduce the size of the battery bank from 122 kilowatt hours, could we have gotten away with an 80 kilowatt hour battery bank? Well, yes, but in that instance, we would be more reliant on the generator to actually work. And the client said, I'd rather spend more money and not rely on the generator. Now, for that matter, when we were evaluating the different sizes between the different batteries, we had another nickel iron battery that said, look, whereas flooded lead acid, you really want to operate in the top end of that range. With a nickel iron, they have no problem doing a daily deep cycle down to 80%. And so the size of the battery bank could be smaller. But that said, we would be starting our generator much more frequently and be relying on our generator much more often. So with PV watts in your monthly bill, you can start to make a stab at your battery bank size. But we do need to understand how to read our battery bank spec sheet for that. What's interesting to me about these spec sheets is that they're all for flooded lead acid. And what we'll notice about these spec sheets, these are for different tiers of flooded lead acid, where these aren't the golf cart batteries, but Trojan will have a renewable line, a signature line that'll be a little bit less than the renewable line, and then a premium line that'll be a little bit more than the renewable line. And this chart that will tell you how many cycles you get at your average depth of discharge. So here is if we did an average 50% depth of discharge, we get to 1,000 cycles. What we can see in these curves is that there's an inflection point where we go from a steeper curve to a shallower curve. Here's an inflection point. Here's an inflection point. And so we see this inflection point kind of occurring around the 40% mark. We see this inflection point kind of occurring around the 65 to 70% mark. And we see this inflection point kind of occurring around the 50% mark. And I'd actually peg this more like 35%. Now, what does that correspond to? And furthermore, what's up with the start of the curve occurring at 20%? Why doesn't it go on up to, shallower than that? Well, flooded lead acid batteries, they have 3 different stages. They call it the float stage, the absorb stage, and the bulk stage. And these also have a relationship to the voltage of the battery. Let's say that this is a 48 volt battery bank. Up at the top of this curve, you're at full voltage, and at the bottom of this curve, you'd be at no voltage. What's interesting about the 48 volts is that it's the nominal voltage. It's not the maximum voltage. And so these batteries might actually be 60 volt batteries. It's just that they're normally operating under load in this 48 volt range. And so when you charge a battery all the way up to full, it's actually going to go up into the above 50 volts. And as it's discharging, the voltage is going to drop, and it actually kind of makes a little bit of an asymptote that makes it hard to determine, exactly how full a battery is by reading its voltage only. So it's more like your battery that's fully charged is at 58 volts, but then it immediately starts to kind of discharge, and then it levels off at maybe slightly above 48 volts. And then as it begins to be fully discharged, it gets slightly below 48 volts, and then all of a sudden it's dead. There's actually, if you had a granular monitor, you could be much more accurate at what point of state of charge you're at, but a simple voltmeter won't do. And so what we're looking at is up here at the top, we're in the float range. And this is a very elastic range for the battery where it can float between, say, 48 and 60 volts. But like a rubber band that's stretched, you can't charge it all the way up to the very top before it wants to kind of drop back down in voltage again. And so actually when we talk about lead acid battery maintenance, what you're doing is you're taking it from the maximum state of charge that it is at under normal operating conditions, and then you're slamming the voltage all the way up to its maximum capacity. And by doing that, it's a very inefficient charging process. You don't do this as a regular course of action. On a day-to-day basis, even though the battery's rated for 60 volts, you don't charge it up to 60. You may only charge it up to 51. But every so often, you'll overcharge it maybe to 54 or 55 volts, because what that's actually going to do is burst some of the plaque that is coating the anode. It'll burst it off of the anode and give you a longer life. So you're conditioning the battery during that time. Then you get into the absorb phase, and this is the area of operation that you want to be using your lead acid battery in. And so you get a difference in product lines in your lead acid batteries, which is a difference in quality. And so you can have a lead acid battery that says, oh, you should only cycle this down no more than 35%, because then you get into the bulk phase. Well, here's a different lead acid battery that you can cycle it down almost to 60% before you get into the bulk phase. And here's a different lead acid battery where you can cycle it down to about 50% before you get into the bulk phase. And guess what? The 60% is more expensive than the 50%, and the 50% is more expensive than the 30%. And that results in all sorts of opinions on lead acid to say, well, you can only do a cycle down to 30%. And the industrial flooded lead acid guys say, well, that's not true. That's for the low-end lead acid. And if you go with a high-end lead acid, then you can do a deeper cycle. And so we go back to our PV watts and hourly data chart, and we say, okay, well, it's all right that, some days we're getting down to a 50% depth of discharge. It's just that most days we're doing a 20% or a 30% depth of discharge. So what's our average depth of discharge? And we saw that for the 105 kilowatt hour battery bank, it was a 30% average depth. And so if we went with this kind of this kind of mid-range premium battery could easily take a daily cycle of right down to 35%, but not much more than that. We say, okay, well, at 35% of a depth of discharge, I'm getting about 2,200 cycles out of it. And so if we know that our battery bank is 105 kilowatt hours, and we know that 35% of that is is going to be about 38 kilowatt hours, and we know how many cycles we have, 2,200 cycles. Well, 2,200 multiplied by about 40 or so. That'll give us, almost, I don't know, let's say 10,000 cycles at 40 kilowatt hours, and we know our cost. We divide our cost by our total kilowatt hour output, and that gives us the levelized cost of storage, which for lead acid was around 19 cents in this signature line range. And so by going from month to month data and taking our charge data from PV watts and looking at the bottom end of that curve and just setting that at a maximum depth of discharge of 80%, and then we get our average daily depth of discharge of 35%, we can hone in on an appropriate operating range for whatever flooded lead acid battery type we select. And it's a very similar process for AGM or gel lead acid. It's just that on those, we're paying more for not having to do maintenance. I just want to make sure I'm not skipping over anything here. I'm going to come back to this. So anyways, when we have our float stage, which is kind of we don't really have to work. We're not really charging our battery. Any kind of cycling at that is really not doing too much damage to the battery. Then we have our normal operating range in this absorb phase, and that's where you want the load coming out and then the solar array charging it back up. When you get past this inflection point and get into this bulk phase, that's when the most amount of damage is occurring to the anode. And so once you get into this bottom range of depth of discharge, it's not that you can't discharge it, but that adage of if you deep discharge a lead acid battery, it won't charge all the way back up again. They're really talking about if you regularly discharge it below the absorb phase, it won't charge back up again. And so you want to make sure that your battery is sized so that your day-to-day operation stays above this inflection point. And once you have those cloudy weather systems come through and your battery starts to discharge down here, you want to crank your generator and charge it all the way back up to the top. Looking at some of our other system components, this was particularly surprising to me. I'm used to doing solar arrays that are up at 600 volts. Well, it turns out that a lot of the charge controllers on the market are made for smaller off-grid systems. And so you can be in, say, Outback, great reputation for off-grid, but they don't have a 600 volt charge controller. They have a 150 volt charge controller. Well, 150 volts, each module is 40 volts. What that really means is your solar circuits on these off-grid are only 3 or 4 modules long. I'm doing a 22 kilowatt array. That has 110 solar modules on it. I don't want to have 30 circuits up on my rooftop. That's just too much wiring. I'm used to doing solar where we have 600 volt circuits of at least 10 modules per circuit. And so, that really helped us determine that we went with Schneider because Schneider had the longest 600 volt charge controller on the market. And because we were doing a rooftop array, where we didn't want to have 30 different circuits, if we were doing a ground mount, maybe doing all that wire management wouldn't have been as big of an issue. But up on the rooftop, you really don't want these 150 volt circuits. It's just too much wiring. And so we went with Schneider because Schneider had both a charge controller and an inverter. We wanted to stay within the same brand name. And then we wanted this 600 volts because it was a rooftop array. This is us taking our PV watts data, our battery bank guess, and pegging it at the 80% depth of discharge and having it charge all the way back up. Now, because it's flooded lead acid, we needed the room to be ventilated. If you're using AGM or gel, they're more susceptible to temperature change than flooded lead acid. That being able to off-gas the battery gives it longer life, better conditioning. When you run up at the float phase, when you run the conditioning and you're overcharging the battery, that's when you produce the gas. And so you can't do that maintenance on these maintenance-free batteries that are sealed up because they would produce too much gas, and that wouldn't be good for the build of the battery. So basically, these maintenance-free lead-acid batteries, there's no free lunch. They have shorter life and higher cost. That's why I think that if you're looking at a sealed lead-acid battery, you should also consider the lithium-ion at that point. But we're going into the garage. What was interesting on the code requirements is that if you have an air-conditioned room, that qualifies as a vented box. So if you have air conditioning, forced air ventilation in your room, you don't really need the batteries to be in a box. However, the gas that comes off of lead acid is corrosive. And so if you have a lot of metal components in your battery room, it's still a good idea to put a hood over the batteries and then directly vent the batteries to the outside, even if your room is otherwise code compliant. And then we really overshot our battery bank size because this was my first system. It's a real house, so we didn't want to undersize it. And the only danger that happens when you oversize a lead acid battery bank is that it lasts longer. So going back to our life cycle charts, it's like if instead of doing a 40% depth of discharge at 2,000 cycles, we do a 20% depth of discharge and we get 4,000 cycles. So, oversizing the battery is not like solar, where if you oversize the inverter, you're not really using the inverter efficiently. If you oversize a battery bank, you get more life and value out of it. If you undersize the battery bank, then you're getting down into this bulk phase that is more damaging for the battery. So it's worse to undersize the battery than oversize it. We already talked about this stuff. We didn't go with the nickel iron because the upfront capital was too much. We talked about how you need to have you need to check your one problem with the SMA product, the Sunny Island, is that it's 120 volt output. So sometimes on these off-grid inverters, you have to get a transformer for them. And sample line diagrams. So here's our budget. We spent we went bargain bin diving for our modules. We just bought by the pallet and got 22 kilowatts for about 12 grand. We went with a railless racking system. It didn't really save us much money. It was a standing seam roof, and on standing seam roof, you have to attach to every single seam. And so even though we weren't buying the rail, it ended up being on the higher end of the cost because we bought a lot of clips. Here we have our inverters, and this was interesting. When you add up the charge controller, the service panel, the inverter, the monitoring, it came out to be about $13,500 for about a $13,000 or for 13 kilowatts of inverter capacity. So the inverter system, not just the inverter itself, but the charge controllers, the service panel, all that comes out to be about $1 a watt in material cost. Whereas a solar inverter, where you're not buying a charge controller, where you don't need to buy a special distribution panel because you need to parallel some multiple DC inverters together, where you don't need to buy all the partridge and a pear tree monitoring components, that might be 30 cents a watt total. And now when you get into the off grid with the more expensive inverters, you're up at $1 a watt. Balance of system material, we ended up going with a 122 kilowatt hour industrial FLA battery that was actually rated all the way down to an 80% depth of discharge. Cost us about $20,000. In total, it cost us about $200 a kilowatt hour of storage capacity. Shipping, sales tax, design fee, he self-installed, came out to be about a $80,000 array after the generator. And that was for a system that didn't really rely upon the generator for anything more than to make sure it ran its maintenance cycles. And then it turns out that we really didn't even need the generator for the maintenance cycles. What we didn't know at the time was if we would be able to get enough power output from our array to power the maintenance cycle during the day. And it as long as you're running your maintenance cycles on a sunny day with no clouds in the sky, you can run the lead acid maintenance with the solar array itself. Now, if we had done a grid-connected solar array, we still could have given him a battery inverter with a smaller battery bank to give him that backup power, and it would have been a more cost-effective and lower-cost project, but there was an element of him just wanting to go off-grid. And in fact, nowadays, the TVA is increasing their grid connection fees and keeping their price of electricity the same. So if they continue that trend into the future, he'll actually come out ahead. His batteries at 122 kilowatt hours, his batteries are rated for an 11-year life, but that was at a average cycle discharge that was well conservative. So his flooded lead acid batteries could last for 20 years. Anyway, I want to get into this commercial demand management case study. But I guess the last thing that I want to say about batteries is another thing that I learned out of this is sometimes it can be a little bit hard to locate the batteries next to the inverter. Let's assume that this is our battery bank and here's our inverter on the wall. We ended up going with 2 circuits of batteries. And the thing is, when you have your batteries, it's very important that you draw the same amount of amperage out of your batteries. And so if you start getting into multiple strings of batteries, like you would get into multiple strings of solar arrays going into an inverter, what happens is your cable links all start to be different sizes. But instead of doing like number 10 cable that's well oversized, you're getting into 2-aught, 3-aught, 4-aught, 250 kcmil, big thick cables that are just appropriately oversized for that surge capacity. And if they're different cable lengths, the internal resistance of that cable is going to be slightly different coming out of each battery. And so most battery enthusiasts only recommend 1 or 2 circuits of batteries total going into a battery inverter, and that limits the kilowatt hour total within a product range. Where when we went and looked at our industrial FLA batteries, the maximum storage capacity we could get with 2 circuits of batteries was about 156 kilowatt hours. And we chose 122 because it was well sized, and that was like their most popular battery size. So it was a little bit cheap. It was slightly cheaper than the others. But that can be a design constraint you run up against, is there is a maximum threshold of storage capacity that you can plug into an inverter simply because of you want to limit your batteries to 1 or 2 circuits and not get into 4 or 5 circuits where you would have different resistances in the different circuits that would eventually result in battery failure. There's also a minimum rating that you'll get in your inverter spec sheets of the minimum amount of storage capacity you can put into an inverter, and it's harsher on inverters that are one-size-fits-all solutions, whereas like the Tesla Powerwall can be a little bit, you can go and buy a 7 kilowatt hour Tesla Powerwall. But for some of the off-grid inverters on the market, like Outback and SMA, per their spec sheets, they really recommend you putting about 20 kilowatt hours on those battery inverters. All right, let's look at the solar peak case study, and then we'll close out class. This slide is not in your program, so you may want to jot them down, or I'll show you how I get my pricing. Just remember it. Basically, you just have to remember whatever pricing you find when you go and Google your battery inverter or your charge controller or the specialty equipment. When you go out and do a competitive bid process, all of these prices will drop by about 20%. That's the difference between going out to bid with a solar distributor versus just buying the components right off the bat off of eBay or Amazon. And so our actual price from the distributors were a little bit under these items on all of them. If you just go and Google your pricing, this is what you'll get. And so when you're doing a commercial design, you have to think about things like, well, it may be that my inverter is appropriately sized and I just need to only increase the size of the battery bank. Or it might be that my battery bank is appropriately sized and I only need to increase the size of my inverter. And you might not need a specialty panel for every single inverter. Usually on these specialty distribution panels, that's so you can connect 2 or 3 inverters into the same panel in parallel. And a lot of this stuff is scalable. So you can take, up to 10, and that's just a number pulled out of my head, but a lot of these battery inverters are scalable up to 100 kilowatts before you get into central battery inverters. And so not all of these prices are just going to scale up in terms of dollars per watt. You really need to have a more specific mindset of designing your battery capacity or your inverter output capacity based on your hard measured interval data. And so to conclude the program, we're going to look at this solar peaker design. I had a student email me and he said, well, I have a high demand charge in my area and I have a medical facility and they've always wanted a solar array, but they've only had these demand charges, so I've never been able to make it work for them. Would batteries be an option? And he's in Colorado. He's not in California where there's a big storage market. And it turns out that he could just do a 14 kilowatt solar array and a 36 kilowatt hour battery. There's a $75,000 system with a 30% markup for his profit, in line with mainstream electrical work. And it gave him a 4-year payback. So what he was surprised to learn was that by using industrial FLA and a solar battery system and designing this peaker model is actually more cost effective than all the residential arrays he had been installing over the past few years. So it's absolutely worth taking a look at. You can The problem is doing a solar peaker model in PV watts is even harder and more difficult than doing an off-grid residential model for a variety of reasons. One, it's not just about energy. It's also about performance. You may not be utilizing your battery every single day. It's going to be more cost effective if you're only turning the battery on and using it fully a few days a month. As the battery bank gets larger, you're going to see your utilization so that it starts to be a little bit more better distributed the larger the battery bank you get. But in this solar peaker plant, we're not trying to do 100% of the energy. We're only trying to do the peak energy of the facility, maybe 20% of the facility's energy use. And the way you model it that I have found is to try and develop a story of how the batteries and the solar array are impacting your load. And that's going to be a little bit more obvious when we open up Energy Toolbase. What I want to point out is that the solar peaker plant may behave differently in different seasons. So this is in Colorado. They have huge heat loads. And so we see his heat load turn on, between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. They're trying to heat the building. And then his load drops down throughout the rest of the day. I mean, really, this client could probably save some money by just taking this spike in his demand and turning the heater on at midnight instead of waiting until 6, using more energy but less power. And so really, his battery is being used in the morning and then being recharged by the solar array in the day. Whereas you get into the summertime, and now it looks like what you'd imagine, it's both the solar array and the battery working together during the day. And then whenever your demand is below your maximum demand, the solar array is charging the battery so that it can be used when your maximum demand is hit. You're actually hard programming the inverters to say whenever your power draw, remember, your voltage is fixed. You're at 208 3-phase, 480 3-phase, 240 volt 3-phase. So your voltage is fixed. And so you just need to monitor the power draw from the grid and say whenever you get more than 200 amps of power draw, turn on the battery bank to get this nice even fixed line. And so in the summertime, the solar array and the batteries are doing load leveling throughout the entire day. And then in the wintertime, we're really just trying to shave off that peak in the morning to produce this 4-year payback with a very good return on investment for the client. So and ironically, this is where instead of doing a $75,000 system with a 4-year payback, we went and did a larger system that really eliminates the electric bill. And this would have been a $250,000 system, and the payback would have been 6.5 years instead of 4 years. So that's where it's ironically, the economies of scale of doing a larger project may in fact be a worse payback than starting small. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity for both residential and commercial installers to start getting into this. Let me show you what it looks like, and then we'll end class. Here's the electric bill that was sent to me. And so it's a utility electric bill for an office, and we see, okay, well, he's using, his energy each month, and it goes up in the summer, down in spring and fall, and then, particularly harsh winters, the electric bill shoots through the roof, and he's paying about $4,000 a month in his electric bill. And then we scroll down to see how the electric bill is calculated, and my goodness, look, he's being billed at almost $27 per kilowatt for his demand. and his energy charge is only a penny a kilowatt hour. So in other words, out of that $4,000, it's almost all demand and almost no energy. In fact, you go back to the PowerPoint, and we really just don't have time to get into this, but you have to remember that there's additional opportunities here. Basically, he has the cheapest energy in the country at a penny a kilowatt hour. So what we've done is we've reduced his demand at this point and got him a good savings, but all of this empty space in the valley is the cheapest electricity in the entire country, which means that not only can you address the electric bill on the top by doing demand reduction and solar and storage, but you might be able to pay for the whole project by getting a Bitcoin miner to come in and say, I'll sell you electricity at a penny and a half a kilowatt hour, and you can Bitcoin mine all the way up to this amount of demand reduction. And so you're turning your electric bill from something that is dynamic and up and down into something that is completely optimized around your point of interconnection, making money both on Bitcoin mining, which is essentially a way to convert electricity into money, and then managing the demand side with your on-site solar peaker plant. And that way you can do all of this and not even necessarily reduce the amount of total power that the utility is providing you. And you can go in and say, look, utility, I have mastered my electric load. No, it is optimal. You know exactly what I want. And if you want me to buy less electricity, I'll do a dispatchable battery if you give me an incentive to do so. So I'm not too concerned about the variable electric grid. Anyway, let's get into Energy Toolbase. What happened is he sent me his interval data. This is what the interval data looks like from the utility. Basically, it's very similar to PV Watts data. For every 15 minutes for the entire year, from January 1st to December 31st, you get your kilowatt hours for every 15 minutes. And so you multiply that by 4, you get your kilowattage. And if we really wanted to, we could take our kilowattage and we could take our time, and we could plot this on a chart and say, okay, let's insert our y-axis chart and come up with we take our total demand and our total chart here. And insert our graph. And what we get, and it's very condensed here, and it takes up a lot of memory to do this. So, but what we get is we can pull this graph out a lot and start seeing it a little bit more resolution on what's going on with our demand. And basically what we'll see as this chart gets wider and wider and wider is what we're about to see in Energy Toolbase. But we see very large, spiky curves of power draw for this client, whereas heaters are clicking on and his building is surging all the way up to 100 kilowatts in heating demand, but his base is way down here at 14 or 15 kilowatts. And this is optimum. This is like the best you could hope for in a battery bank, because again, we're only going to be running the batteries for like an hour or two a day, and we can take this demand all the way down to something very substantial. Then again, when the summertime rolls around, we don't have that heating, and now almost counterintuitively, his building demand in the summertime drops substantially. Again, this is in Denver, Colorado, or outlying areas. So now we're using our commercial software, and that's really the hard part is you kind of have to reconcile the differences between wintertime and summertime electric use, and still have demand savings able to be occurred in the spring and fall, and hone in on what is optimal for that. And that's back to where I think it's good to kind of take a close look at how your battery and your solar array sizes are impacting your electric bill, and try and put it into a storyline so that you can explain what's going on, so that you can better determine the the optimal size. And so for that, it's good to visualize the load profile. So like what this commercial software, Energy Toolbase, has done is made it very easy to visualize and develop cash flow models on what's going on. So this is for a very small array. This is a 12 kilowatt array with like a 35 kilowatt hour battery. And what we see is the current demand, where it's very tall and spiky. And in light green down here, we see the solar array turning on and off and on and off and on and off. And then we see in the battery power in tan. And then I think what's particularly important is the battery state of charge, which is in red, 1 being full and 0 being empty. And so what I think is particularly important is to look at your net demand for your building and the state of charge of the battery. So here we are on the first day of the month, and our battery's full, and then we see our building demand spiking up, and we see the battery turning on and dropping the state of charge of the battery, and the battery state of charge gets down to 40%. And then the sun comes back up and we charge all the way to full. And then the next day, the same thing happens. The battery drops down to 30% and then down to 20%. And then the sun comes up and we get all the way back up to full. And so what we see is right here on the very first day of the month, we hit our maximum demand of 70 kilowatts. And so now the battery doesn't really need to work as long as the demand is below that 70. And so we see on Sundays, we're just skipping over any kind of demand management because we're still below that 70 point. And only when we get to approaching 70 kilowatts of power draw does the battery click on. And so we go through every single day of the month, and we never see the battery dropping down. And what we want to look at is what are days that are risky of the battery running out of power. And so we see here the battery's at 23%, and we just get through the tail end of the day before the demand starts to slack back up and the battery's able to charge back up from solar. And so this is kind of like what an optimally sized battery bank looks like. But look, it's in the storyline mentality, there's still some room to grow because we are still seeing, this spiky kind of power curve. So, what we could do is double the size of the battery bank. The solar array is well sized because the battery is able to charge back up to the top every day. So we don't really need to increase the size of our solar array, but we could potentially keep increasing the size of our battery bank and having it be very cost effective. And so this is for January. Now let's go into the summertime. And now, remove the current demand. Now it's a little bit different. instead of seeing these spiky triangles, now we see plateaus. And so what's happening now is instead of having that heating demand, it's a air conditioning demand and normal office use demand. And so, instead of the battery only needing to work for an hour or two, we're actually having the combination of solar and battery work throughout the entire day. And so the story that this tells is that in the summertime, what we have is there's certain times when we're below our maximum demand when the solar array is charging the battery bank, and then there's other times when the solar array is working with the battery bank. And so if we wanted to, and then we look at the state of charge. I'll take the solar array out, just look at our net demand and state of charge, and then here we are at the beginning of the day. The battery's at full charge, and then it drops down while it's doing its load leveling, and it's able to charge all the way back up. Then drops down doing its load leveling, able to charge all the way back up. But then we get to this point where on this particular day, it didn't charge all the way back up. Maybe that was a partly cloudy day. And then the next day comes through, and again, the battery and the building demand, the solar array is doing some of it, but the solar array is not quite large enough to charge on this partly cloudy day the battery all the way back up to the top. And so now what we start to see is that during the week, the battery state of charge starts to get lower and lower and lower. And it almost gets to the point where now in the summertime, we're at a 30 or 29% depth of discharge. That's starting to get a little dangerous. So maybe we can increase the battery size a little bit. But then again, maybe we should increase the solar array size a little bit too, because it's not getting all the way back up to the top. And so our summertime story is telling us that, hey, we could be increasing these sizes. But then again, we've already addressed kind of the low-hanging fruit, because to get additional demand savings out of it, we would really have to be running the battery from, changing the resolution on this down to say 1 day. We can go and look at our maximum day here, and that's pretty flat. I mean, our peak demand is starting at 9:30 a.m. in the morning, and our peak demand is kind of ending at right around 7:45 p.m. at night, and our solar array at this time is really starting at about 8 or 9:30 in the morning. And because it's partly cloudy on this day, our solar array has started to turn off around 4. And so really, our solar array is already working all day. I mean, it could be increased in size maybe a little bit, but then our battery is going to have to work from 4 o'clock to about 8 o'clock at night. So our battery is going to have to work for 4 hours at least to do some demand management. And potentially on a partly cloudy day, our battery would really have to work for 8 or 9 or 10 hours if it was a partly cloudy day, just to do that much demand management. And so maybe we're already all the way as much down the mountain as we possibly could be, and there might be some trade-off where we could get a little bit more savings in the winter time that would justify it. But at that point, we might want to start looking at, well, how do we use more energy during these off-peak times profitably? So then we go and we start experimenting. So we say, okay, well, using some other, benchmarks, we can see, back in our storage component that the effective value of this battery is $189 a kilowatt hour. That's great. if we went into our simulation and we said, okay, well, let's just do a flat out, let's increase our battery bank to 72 kilowatt hours, and because we're adding 30 kilowatt hours at $200 a kilowatt hour, that's going to increase our cost by another $6,000 plus labor. So let's go up to a $50,000 solar array, because we're not changing our inverter capacity or whatever. We're just putting on more batteries onto our circuit. So we go and save that data, and now this $189 effective generation rate, let's see what happens to it. It's dropped down to 114. And so that really didn't improve our payback. We go back into our energy analytics and go back into our demand profile visualization, and we say, okay, well, what did that really give us? We still have these plateaus and we're not much further down them. And basically, what we're seeing is once you get past the spiky points in the summertime, to take the array much further, you get into diminishing returns. We could go and take another look back at our wintertime, and we see our demand drop a lot more than previous. What we really want to look at is on that first day of the month, look, we're no longer hitting our max. Initially, we looked at that first day of the month, and that was our maximum. Now, it's only on into the month where we get to our maximum. And so we have made an impact by doubling that battery size, and maybe we get some more savings in the winter time, but they're not so apparent as before. And so that's when we've gone and we've modeled a larger array, where instead of doing a 12 kilowatt solar array on a battery inverter with surge capacity, in this scenario, we're doing we're doing a 120 kilowatt array, so something much larger, and we've achieved some economies of scale. Instead of doing a $3 a watt install, we're doing a $1.80 or $1.70 a watt install on the solar component. And here, instead of doing a $30,000 battery, we're doing a $70,000 battery. That's 162 kilowatt hours. So we've increased our array size and haven't really increased the solar size all that much. And so this is a larger array, like something that might knock out the whole electric bill if they had net metering. And now look, our story has completely changed. What we have here now in our story is that our battery is being slammed all the way back up to its maximum charge every single day. We go and we look at our net demand, and now, in addition to the summertime where we had those plateaus, now we have plateaus in the wintertime as well. In fact, we have so much surplus electricity that we're outflowing onto the grid, which is what we weren't doing beforehand. So that, that outflow, we don't really care because it's only valued at a penny a kilowatt hour. Then we go and we look at the summertime, and basically our solar array is so powerful in the summertime that we've completely eliminated any draw from the grid aside from maybe a day or two a month. So this would be like a building in Hawaii that is completely self-reliant, and it's just connected to the grid because it might as well sell the electricity at a penny a kilowatt hour. And then at the end of the day, we go and we look at the cash flow model for this larger, oversized array. Instead of having a 4-year payback, our payback is 6.6 years. So, we've sold a $250,000 project instead of a $75,000 project. It has a 7-year payback instead of a 4-year payback, which is still pretty good. And then at the end of the day, what we've done in this case is we're actually generating 100% of the building's energy rather than 20%. And then we go and look at the impact. An energy tool base will show you, the caseload conditions of every month of the year in their little report. And the problem is to hone in on this, you have to go and take a guess on what the best array and battery size is. And then you have to run some more simulations and say, well, what if I increase the battery size? What if I just increase the inverter capacity? What if I just increase my solar array capacity? And then kind of hone in on your optimal configuration that way. And basically what we've done by doing a larger array and a larger battery bank is that we've fully eliminated his electric bill. Where he's every month of the year he no longer has an electric bill and he's actually selling back to the utility, but that is a less profitable investment than just going after the peak. And so we're out of time. Again, geez, I guess I really went over. We're out of time. We're going to go to the quiz, but the takeaway is that there's a new kid on the block. It's called a solar peaker plant, where if you just go for a small amount of energy use and demand reduction with industrial lead-acid batteries, you can develop under the best circumstances of high demand charges paybacks that are within capital equipment financing terms of 7 years, and it can actually be the most profitable solar array in your area. So if you need stuff modeled or you want to learn more about that, send me an email and I'll get you plugged into that community. With that, thank you for coming, and I'll pass it back to Half Moon.
Thank you, JR. I want to remind everyone to take the quiz after the webinar ends if you need continuing education credit for this webinar. Certificates will be emailed in PDF form, and if you have any remaining questions, you can reply to any emails you have received regarding these seminars or call into our office. Thanks again to Mr. Cromer for the presentation and to everyone in attendance. Here's your quiz.